1. The vast bulk of Ben Cleverig was dark in shadow, but the wide waters of Loch Nava shone a soft silver grey in the moonlight, as Hector McIntyre, keeper and forester in the far solitudes of Glengorm, came striding along the road toward Invermoodal. As he approached the little hamlet, which consists merely of the inn and its surroundings, and one or two keepers' cottages, certain small points of red told him of its whereabouts among the black trees, and as he drew still nearer, he thought he would let the good people there know of his coming. Hector had brought his pipes with him, for there were to be great doings on this Halloween night, and now, when he had inflated the bag and tuned the drones, there sprang into the profound silence reigning everywhere around this wild skirl of the hills of Glenorchy. Surely the sound would reach and carry its message. If not, here was Gilead Rover, played still more bravely, and again the proud strains of the Glen's Mine, by which time he had got near to the inn, and was about to turn down from the highway by the semicircular drive passing the front door. But here he suddenly encountered a fearful sight. From out of the dusk of the wall surrounding the front garden, there came three luminous objects, three globes of a dull saffron hue, and on each of these appeared the features of a face, eyes, mouth, and nose, all flaming in fire. On beholding this terrible thing, the tall, brown-bearded forester turned and fled, and the pipes told of his dismay, for they shrieked and groaned and made all sorts of indescribable noises, as if they too were in mortal alarm. Then Mrs. Murray's three children, with victorious shouts of laughter, pursued the tall forester, and kept waving before them the hollowed-out turnips, with a bit of candle burning within. When he had got up to the corner of the road, Hector turned and addressed the children, who had come crowding round him, holding up their flaming turnips to cause him still further dismay. "Well now," said he, in the Gaelic, "there is a fearful thing to alarm any poor person with. Were you not thinking I should die of fright? And the pipes squealing as well, for they never saw anything like that before. But never mind, we are going down to the house now. And do you know, Roland and Isabel, and you, little Shayna, do you know, I have brought you some of the fir tops that grow in Glengorm. For it is a wonderful place, Glengorm, and the fir tops that grow on the larches there are not as the fir tops that grow anywhere else. They are very small, and they are round, and some are pink, and some are blue, and some are black and white, and some others, why, they have an almond inside them. Oh, it is a wonderful place, Glengorm. But it is not always you can get the fir tops from the larches. It is only on some great occasion like the Halloween night. And let me say now, if I put any of them in my pocket, here, Ronald, take the pipes from me, and hold them properly on your shoulder, for one day you will be playing Miss Ramsay Strathspey as well as any one, and I will search my pockets and say if I put any of those wonderful fir tops into them." The children knew very well what all this preamble meant, but neither they nor their elders could have told how it was that Hector McIntyre, every time he came to Invermoodal, brought with him packages of sweetmeats, though he lived in one of the most inaccessible districts in Sutherland, Glengorm being about 22 miles away from anywhere. However, here was a precious little parcels, and when they had been distributed, Hector took his pipes again, and escorted by his small friends, went down to the inn. Well, Mr. Murray, the innkeeper, had also heard the distant skirl of the pipes, and here he was at the door. "How are you, Hector?" he asked in Gaelic. "What is your news?" "There is not much news in Glengorm," was the answer. "And when is your wedding to be?" Mr. Murray said. "We will make a grand day of that, Hector. And I have been thinking I will get some of the lads to kindle a bonfire on the top of Ben Cleverig, a fire that they will see down in Rossshire. And there's many a pistol and many a gun will make a crack when you drive up to this door and bring your bride in, for I am one who believes in the old customs, and whether it is a wedding or the New Year or Halloween night, I am for the old ways, and the Free Church ministers can say what they like. Now come away, and Hector, my lad, and take a dram after your long walk. There is plenty of hard work before you this evening, for Johnny has broken his fiddle, and the lasses have not been asked to dance up a reel for many a day." And then he paused and said, "And how is Flora Campbell, Hector? Have you any news of her?" "No," said the forester, in something of an undertone, and his face looked troubled. I have had no letter for a while back, and I do not know what it means. Her sister that lives in Greenock has taken ill, and Flora said she must go down from Oban to see her, and that is the last I have heard. If I knew her sister's address in Greenock, I would write and ask Flora why there was no letter so long. But if you send a letter to one called Mary Campbell in such a big place as Greenock, what use is it? But no news is good news, Hector, said Mr. Murray cheerfully. And therewith he led the way through a stone corridor into the great kitchen, where a considerable assemblage of lads and lasses were engaged in noisy merriment and pastime. The arrival of the tall forester and his pipes were hailed with general satisfaction, but there was no call as yet for the inspiring music. In fact, this big kitchen was given over to the games of the children and the younger boys and girls, a barn having been prepared for supper, and for the celebration of occult Halloween rites, when the time came for their elders to take part in the festivities. At present there was a large tub filled with water placed in the middle of the floor, and there were apples in it, and the youngsters, with their hands behind their backs, were trying to snatch out an apple with their teeth. There was many a sousing of heads, of course, in excellent trial of temper, while sometimes a bolder wight than usual would pursue his prize to the bottom and try to fasten upon it there, or some shy young damsel would cunningly shove the apple over to the side of the tub, and succeed by mother wit where masculine courage had failed. Then from the roof, suspended by a cord, hung a horizontal piece of wood, at one end of which was an apple, at the other a lighted tallow candle, and when the cord had been twisted up and set free again, causing the transverse piece of wood to whirl around, the competitor was invited to snatch with his mouth at the apple, failing to do which secured him a rap on the cheek from the guttering candle. There were all sorts of similar diversions going forward, the origin and symbolism of them little dreamt of by these light-hearted lads and lasses, when little Isabel Murray came up to the big, handsome, good-natured-looking forester from Glengorm. "Will you burn a nut with me, Hector?" she said kindly. "Indeed I will, Isabel, if you will take me for your sweetheart," said he in reply. "And now we will go to the fire, and see whether we are to be at peace and friendship all our lives." They went to the hearth. They put the 2 nuts among the blazing pates, and awaited the response of the oracle. Could any augury have been more auspicious? The 2 nuts lay together, burning steadily and quickly, a soft love flame, no angry sputtering, no sudden explosion and separation. "Now do you see that lamb of my heart?" said the tall forester, using a familiar Gaelic phrase. And no doubt the little lass was very highly pleased. However, at this moment up came Mrs. Murray, with the announcement that the children might continue at their games some time longer, but that the grown-up folk were wanted in the barn, where supper was waiting them. It was a joyous scene. The huge peat fire was blazing brightly. The impoverished chandelier was studded with candles. There were a couple of lamps on the long table, which were otherwise most sumptuously furnished, and when Hector McIntyre, in his capacity of piper, had played the people into the stirring strains of the Marchioness of Tweeddale's Delight, he put the pipes aside, and went and took the seat that had been reserved for him by the side of the fair-haired Nelly, who was very smartly dressed for this great occasion, as befitting the reigning beauty of the neighbourhood. "You'll be sorry that Flora is not here tonight," said the fair-haired damsel, rather saucily, to her brown-bearded companion. "And no one to take her place? I suppose there was no one in Sutherland good enough for you, Hector, that you must take up with the lass from Islay. And there is little need for you to dip your slave in the burn and hang it up to dry when you go to bed, so that the fire may show you your sweetheart, for well you know already who that is. Well, well, you will have no heart for the merrymaking tonight, for a lad that has a sweetheart away in the south has no heart for anything." "You'll just mind this, Nelly," said the forester, "not to carry your merrymaking too far this night. Alistair Ross," he continued, glancing down the table toward the huge, rough, red-bearded drover who was seated there, "is not the man to be made a fool of, and if that young fellow Semple does not take heed, he will find himself gripped by the waist some fine dark evening and flung into Loch Naver." "Oh, you are like all the rest, Hector," said the coquettish Nelly with some impatience. "Every one of you is jealous of Johnny Semple, because he is neatly dressed, and has good manners, and is civil-spoken." "What is he doing here at all?" said Hector with a frown. "Is it a fine thing to see a young man idling about a place with his hands in his pockets, just because his uncle is the landlord? If he has learned his fine manners in the towns, why does he not earn his living in the towns? He is no use here." "Oh no, said Nelly, with a toss of her head. "Perhaps he's not much use on the hill. Perhaps he could not set traps and shoot hawks. But he knows all the new songs from the theatre, and he can dance more steps than anyone in Sutherland." "Well, this is what I am telling you, Nelly," her companion said with some firmness. "I do not know what there is between you and Alister Ross. If there is anything, as people say, then do not make him an angry man. Let Simple alone. An honest lass should beware of a town dandy like that." Here this private little conversation was interrupted by Mr. Murray, who rose at the head of the table and called upon the company to fill their glasses. He wished to drink with them, as they did not seem loath. When Hector and his pretty companion found opportunity to resume their talk, he discovered that Nelly was in quite a different mood. "Well, now it is a good thing, Hector, that everyone knows that you and Flora are to be married, for I can talk to you without Alister getting red in the face with rage. And when we go out to pull the cabbage stalks, will you go with me? I know the way into the garden better than you, and we can both go blindfold if you will take my hand." "But what need is there for you to pull a cabbage stalk, lass?" said he. "Do you not know already what like your husband is to be?" Again the pretty Nelly tossed her head. "Who can tell what is to happen in the world?" "And maybe you would rather not pull a stalk that was tall and straight and strong. That would mean Alister," said the companion, glancing at her suspiciously. "Maybe you would rather find you had got hold of a withered old stump with a lot of earth at the root, a decrepit old man with plenty of money in the bank. Or maybe you are wishing for one that is slim and supple and not so tall, for one that might mean Johnny Simple." "I am wishing to know who the man is to be, and that is all," said Nelly, with some affectation of being offended. "And what harm can there be in doing what everyone else is doing?" However, not all Nelly's blandishments and petulant coquetries could induce Hector McIntyre to take part in this appeal to the divinations of the Kailyard, for when after supper the lads and lasses went away blindfold to pull the cassock that was to reveal to them the figure and circumstances of their future spouse, the big forester remained to have a quick smoke with the married keepers and shepherds who had no interest in such matters. It was noticed that he was unusually grave, he who was ordinarily one of the lightest of the light-hearted. Naturally, they put it down to the fact that among all the merrymaking and sweethearting and spying into the future of the young people, he alone had no companion, or rather not the companion whom he would have wished to have. For Flora, the young girl whom he was to marry, had left Invermoodal for the south in the preceding autumn, and when they had asked if Flora was quite well, and when he had answered, "Oh yes," there was nothing further to be said. 2. Now, on All Hallows Eve, there is one form of incantation which is known to be extremely, nay, terribly potent when all others have failed. You go out by yourself, taking a handful of hemp seed with you. You get to a secluded place and begin to scatter the seed as you walk along the road. You say, "Hemp seed, I sow thee. Hemp seed, I sow thee. He who is to be my true love, appear now and show thee." And if you look furtively over your shoulder, you will behold the desired apparition following you. When Nelly came back from consulting the oracle of the Kailyard, it appeared that she had received what oracles generally vouchsafe, a doubtful answer. "What kind of custard did you pull, Nelly?" Hector asked of her. "Well," said she, "it is not much one way or the other. No, I cannot tell anything by it, but I am going out now to sow the hemp seed, Hector. I shall be far too frightened to look over my shoulder, and this is what I want you to do for me. You will stop at the door of the inn and hide yourself, and I will go up the road and sow the hemp seed, and if anything appears, you will see it. Will you do that, Hector? It is a clear night. You will be sure to see if there is anything." He did not seem in the mood for taking part in these superstitious observances, but he was good-natured, and eventually followed her to the door. The little walled garden in front of Invermoodal Inn is shaped like a horseshoe, the two ends of the semicircle touching the main highway at some distance apart. He saw Nelly go up toward the main road, and looked after her absently and without interest. Nay, he was so little thinking of his promised watch, that as she was some time over the sowing of the hemp seed, he left the shadow of the inn door and strolled away up the main road by the other fork of the semicircular drive. It was a beautiful, clear moonlit night. His thoughts were far away from the Halloween diversions. He was recalling other evenings long ago, when Clebrig as now seemed joining earth and heaven, and when there was no sound but the murmuring of the burns through the trackless heather. The highway up there was white before him. On the other side was a plantation of young firs, black as jet. Not even the cry of a startled bird broke this perfect stillness. The wide world of mountains and lochs and moor was plunged in sleep profound. All at once his pipe, that he happened to be holding in his hand, dropped to his feet. There before him in the white highway, and between him and the black belt of the firs, stood Flora Campbell, regarding him with eyes that said nothing, but only stared in a somewhat sad way, as it seemed. He was not paralyzed with terror at all. He had no time to ask himself what she was doing here, or how she had come here. Flora Campbell, standing there in the road, and looking at him in silence. And then the horror came when suddenly he saw that the white highway was empty. He began to shake and shiver as if with extremity of cold. He did not move. He could not move. He knew what had happened to him now. Flora Campbell's wraith had appeared to him. But with what message? The steady gaze of her eyes had told him nothing. If they were anything, they were mournful. Perhaps it was a token of farewell. Perhaps it was an intimation of death. Hardly knowing what he did, and trembling in every limb, he advanced a step or two, so that he could command the whole length of the highway. There was no sign of any living thing there. He could not recall how it was she first appeared. He could not tell in what manner she had gone away. He only knew that for a few moments before, Flora had been regarding him with steady plaintive eyes, and that now he was alone with this moonlit road and black plantation, and Clebrig rising far into the silent heavens. Then there arose in his heart a wild resolve that whatever this thing might portend, he must instantly make way for the south, to seek out Flora Campbell herself. She had something to say to him surely, though those mournful eyes conveyed no intelligible message. Ay, if she were dead, if this were but a mute farewell, must he not know? Dazed, bewildered, filled with terrible misgivings of he knew not what, he slowly went back to the inn. He had some vague instinct that he must ask Mr. Murray for the loan of a stick if he were to set out now to cross the leagues of wild and mountainous country that lie between Invermoodal and the sea. Mr. Murray, as it chanced, was at the door. "God's sakes, Hector, what is the matter with you?" he exclaimed in alarm, for there was a strange look in his face. "I have seen something this night," was the answer, spoken slowly and in an undertone. "Nonsense, nonsense," the innkeeper said. "The heads of the young people are filled with foolishness on Halloween, as every one knows. But you are not to be frightened by their stories." "It has naught to do with Halloween," said Hector, still with his eyes fixed on the ground, as if seeking to recall something. "Do you know what I have seen this night? I have seen the wraith of Flora Campbell. Aye, as clear as daylight." "I do not believe it, Hector," said Mr. Murray. "You have been hearing all those stories of the witches and fairies on Halloween until your own head has been turned. Why, where did you see the wraith?" "Up there in the road, and as clear as daylight, for that is the truth. It was Flora herself," the tall forester made answer, not argumentatively, but as merely stating a fact that he knew. "And did she come forward to you, or did she go away from you?" Mr. Murray asked curiously. I am not sure," Hector said after a little hesitation. "No, I could not say. Perhaps I was not thinking of her. But all at once I saw her between me and the plantation in the middle of the road, and for a moment I was not frightened. I thought it was Flora herself. Then she was gone." "For you know what they say, Hector," Mr. Murray continued. "When a wraith appears, it is to tell you of a great danger, and if it comes forward to you, then the danger is over. But if it goes away from you, the person is dead." "Aye, aye, I've heard that too," Hector murmured, as if in sombre reverie. Then he looked up and said, "I am going away to the south." "Well, now, that is unfortunate, Hector," the good-natured innkeeper said to him. "For tomorrow the mail comes north, and you will have to wait till the next day for the mail going south, to take you to the Lairg to catch the train." "I will not wait for the mail," answered the forester, who indeed knew little about travelling by railway. "Tomorrow is Wednesday. It is the day the big steamer starts from Loch Inver. Perhaps I may be in time." "Loch Inver!" the other exclaimed. "And how are you going to get to Loch Inver from here, Hector?" "Across the forest," was the simple reply. "Across the Ray forest and down by Loch Assynt. That will be a fearful journey through the night." "I cannot rest here," Hector said. "You will make some excuse for me to the lads and lasses. I will leave my pipes. Long Murdoch will do very well with them. And I will thank you to lend me a stick, Mr. Murray, for it will be a rough walk before I have done." Mr. Murray did more than that. He got his wife to make up a little packet of food, to which he added a flask of whisky, and these he took out for the young man, along with a shepherd's staff of stout hazel. "Goodbye, Hector," said he. "I hope you will find all well in the south." "I do not know about that," the forester answered in an absent sort of fashion, "but I must go and see. There will be no peace of mind for me. There would not be one moment's peace for me, otherwise, for who knows what Flora wanted to say to me." 3. It was an arduous task he had set before him. For 9 men out of 10 it would have been an impossible one. But this young forester's limbs knew not what fatigue was, and in his heart there burned a longing that could not be assuaged. Nor in ordinary circumstances would the loneliness of this night journey have mattered to him, but his nerves had been unstrung by the strange thing that had happened, and now, as he followed the shepherd's track that led away into the higher moorlands south of the Moudal river, he was conscious of some mysterious influence surrounding him that was of far more immediate concern than the mere number of miles, some 40 or 50, he had to accomplish before noon of the next day. Those vast solitudes into which he was penetrating were apparently quite voiceless and lifeless, and yet he felt as if they knew of his presence and were regarding him. A white stone on a dark heather-covered knoll would suddenly look like a human face, or again he would be startled by the moonlight shining on a small turn set among the black peat-hogs. There was no moaning of the wind, but there was a distant murmuring of water. The rills were whispering to each other in the silence. As for the mountains, those lone sentinels, Ben Loyal and Ben Hope and Ben He, they also appeared to be looking down upon the desolate plain. But he did not heed them. They were too far away. It was the objects near him that seemed to know he was here, and to take sudden shapes as he went by. Soon he was without even a shepherd's track to guide him, but he knew the lay of the land, and he held on in a line that would avoid the lochs, the deeper burns, and the steep heights of Mial and Amare. The moonlight was of great help. Indeed, at this period of his long through-the-night tramp, he was chiefly engaged in trying to recall how it was he first became sensible that Flora Campbell's wraith appeared before him. He saw again, surely he would never forget to his dying day, the most insignificant feature of the scene, the stone wall of the garden, the white road, the wire fence of the other side, and the black plantation of spruce and pine. What had he been thinking about? Not about Nellie. She was some distance in another direction, busy with her charms and incantations. No, he could not tell. The sudden apparition had startled him out of all memory. But what he was most anxious to convince himself was that the phantom had come toward him, rather than gone away from him ere it disappeared. Mr. Murray's words had sunk deep, though he himself had been aware of the familiar superstition. But now all his endeavours to summon up an accurate recollection of what had taken place were of no avail. He knew not how he first became conscious that the wraith was there, Flora Campbell herself, as it seemed to him, nor how it was he suddenly found himself alone again. He had been terrified out of his senses. He had no power of observation left. This phantasm that looked so like a human being, that regarded him with pathetic eyes, that had some mysterious message to communicate, and yet was silent, had vanished as it had appeared. He could not tell how. The hours went by. The moon was sinking toward the western hills, and still he toiled on through his pathless waste, sometimes getting into treacherous swamps, again having to ford burns swollen by the recent rains. He was soaked through to the waist, but little he heeded that. His thoughts were of his steamer that was to leave Lochinver the next day. With the moon going down, darkness was slowly resuming her reign, and it became more difficult to make out the landmarks. But, at all events, the heavens remained clear, and he had the guidance of the stars. And still steadily and patiently and manfully he held on, getting across the streams that fed Loch Fiodag without much serious trouble, until eventually he struck the highway running southward from Loch Lynn, and knew that so far at least he was in the right direction. Leaving the Corrie Kinloch road again, he had once more to plunge into the trackless wilderness of rock and swamp and moorland, and the further he went through the black night, the less familiar was he with the country, for he had a general knowledge, and what matters half a dozen miles one way or the other. If only the dawn could show him Benmore on his left, and always before him the silver-grey waters of Loch Assynt. He was less conscious now of the sinister influences of these lonely solitudes. His nervous apprehensions had given way before this dogged resolve to get out of the western shores in time to catch the steamer. All his attention was given to determining his course by the vague outlines of the higher hills. A wind had arisen, a cold, raw wind it was, but he cared nothing for that, unless indeed it should bring a smour of rain and obliterate the landmarks altogether. How anxiously he prayed for the dawn! If this wind were to bring driving mists of rain, blotting out both earth and heaven, and limiting his visions to the space of moorland immediately surrounding him, where would be his guidance then? He could not grope his way along the slopes that lie beneath Loch Manscarrir, nor yet across the streams that fall into Loch Fionn. So all the more resolutely he held on, while as yet he could make out something of the land, dark against the tremulous stars. Again and again he turned his head and scanned the east with a curious mingling of impatience and hope and longing, and at last, to his unspeakable joy, he was able to convince himself that the horizon there was giving up faint signs of the coming dawn. He went forward with a new confidence, with a lighter step. The horror of these awful solitudes would disappear with the declaring day. Surely, surely, when the world had grown white again, he would behold before him not this terrible black loneliness of mountains and mere, but the pleasant abodes of men and trees in the western ocean, and the red funnel steamer with its welcome smoke. The grey light in the east increased. He began to make out the features of the ground near him. He could tell a patch of heather from a deep hole, and could choose his way. The world seemed to broaden out. Everything, it is true, was as yet wan and spectral and ill-defined, but the silence was no longer awful. He had no further fear of the mists coming along to isolate him in the dark. By slow degrees, under the widening light of the sky, the various features of this wild country began to take more definite shape. Down there in the south lay the mighty mass of Ben More. On his right rose the sterile altitudes of Ben Uid. And at last, and quite suddenly, he came in view of the ruffled silvery surface of Loch Assynt, and the cottages of Incoadamph, and the grey ruins of the Ardrock Castle on the promontory jutting out into the lake. The worst of the sore fight with solitude and the night was over. He gained the road, and his long swinging stride now stood him in good stead. Loch Assynt was soon left behind. He followed the windings of the river inward. Finally he came in sight of the scattered little hamlet facing the western sea, with its bridge and its church and its pleasant woods and slopes, looking all so cheerful and homelike. And there also was the red funnelled Plousman that was to carry him away to the south. 4. That long and difficult struggle to get out to the western coast in time had so far demanded all his energy and attention. But now, in enforced idleness, as a heavy steamer ploughed her way through the blue waters of the Mink, his mind could go back upon what had happened the preceding night, and could also look forward with all sorts of dark and indefinite forebodings. He began to recall his first association with Flora Campbell, when she came to Ochnaver Lodge to help the old housekeeper there. He remembered how neat and trim she looked when she walked into the Strathy Free Church of a Sunday morning, and how shy she was when he got to know her well enough to talk a little with her when they met in their native tongue. Their courtship and engagement had the entire approval of Flora's master and mistress, for the old housekeeper at the lodge was now past work, and they proposed to install Hector's wife in her place, and give her a permanent situation. The wedding was to be in February or March. In April the young wife was to move into the lodge, to get it ready for the gentlemen coming up for the salmon fishing. When the fishing and shooting of the year was over, Flora could return to her husband's cottage, and merely look in at the lodge from time to time to light a fire or two and keep the place aired. Meanwhile, for this present winter, she had taken a situation in Oban. She was a West Highland girl, and had remained there until summoned away to Greenock by the serious illness of her sister. Such was the situation. But who could tell now what was to become of all those fair prospects and plans? Was it to bid a last farewell to them, and to him that the young Highland girl had appeared, saying good-bye with such mournful eyes? The small parlour in his cottage, was she never to see the little adornments he had placed there, all for her sake? Well then, if what he feared had come true, no other woman should enter and take possession. There were dreams of Canada, of Cape Colony, of Australia in his brain, as he sat there with bent brow and heavy heart, taking hardly any heed of the new shores they were now nearing. This anguish of brooding became at length insupportable. In despair he went to the stevedore, and said he would be glad to lend a hand with a cargo as soon as the steamer was alongside the quay in Stornoway harbour. And right hard he worked too, hour after hour, feeding the steam crane that was swinging crates and boxes over and down into the hold. The time passed more easily in this fashion. His chum was a good-natured young fellow, who seemed rather proud of his voice, At times he sang snatches of Gaelic songs. Mairi Pin, Meol Shuliach, Mary of the Bewitching Eyes, or Ait in Kaidil and Ribbin, Where Sleepest Thou, Dear Maiden? They were familiar songs, but there was one still more familiar that woke strange echoes in his heart. For Flora Campbell was a West Country girl, and of course her favourite was the well-known Fiera Bata. I climbed the mountains and scanned the ocean, for thee, my boatman, with fond devotion. When shall I see thee? Today, tomorrow. Oh, do not leave me in lonely sorrow. O my boatman, ma horo ailia. O my boatman, na horo ailia. O my boatman, na horo ailia. O my boatman, na horo ailia. 100 farewells to you, wherever you may be going. That is how it begins in the English, but it was the Gaelic phrases that haunted his brain, and brought him remembrance of Flora's crooning voice, and of a certain autumn evening, when he and she and some others went all the way down Loch Naver to Invermoodal, Flora and he sitting together in the stern of the boat, and all of them singing the Fiera Bata. The clansmen left Stornoway that same night, groaning and thundering through the darkness on a way to Skye. Hector did not go below into the forecabin. He remained on deck, watching the solitary ray of some distant lighthouse, or perhaps turning his gaze upon the great throbbing vault overhead, where Cassiopeia sat, throned upon her silver chair. More than once an aerolite shot swiftly across the clear heavens, leaving a faint radiance for a second or so in its wake. But he took no heed of these portents now. In other circumstances they might mean something, but now a more direct summons had come to him from the unknown world. The message had been delivered, though he had been unable to understand it, and he knew that what was to happen had now happened in that far town of Greenock. And all the slow hours went by, his impatience and longing increasing almost to despair. The dark loom of land in the south appeared to come no nearer. The monotonous throbbing of the screws seemed as if it were to go on forever, and as yet there was no sign of the dawn. But the new day, which promised to be quite insupportable in its tedium and in its fears, in reality brought him some distraction, and that was welcome enough. At Portree there came on board a middle-aged man of rather mean aspect, with broken nose, long upper lip, and curiously set small grey eyes. He carried a big bag, which apparently held all his belongings, and that he threw on to the luggage on the forward deck. "Where's this going to?" called the stevedore. "Sure, 'tis bound for the same place as myself," said the newcomer facetiously. "And that's Philadelphia, begob." "We don't call there," retorted the stevedore dryly. "And you'd better stick to your bundle if you want to see it at Greenock." And very soon it became apparent that the advent of this excited and voluble Irishman had brought new life into the steerage portion of the ship. He had had a glass or two of whisky. He talked to everybody within hearing about himself, his plans, his former experiences of the United States, and when gravelled for lack of matter, he would fall back on one invariable refrain: "Oh, begob, the Americans are the boys." And in especial were his confidences bestowed on Hector McIntyre, the shy and reserved Highlander, listening passively and without protest to Parry's wild asseverations. "Oh, the Americans are the devils, and no mistake," he exclaimed. "But let me tell you this, sir, that there's one there's cleverer than them, and that's the Irish boy, begob. Sure, they talk about the German vote. Ah, blathershine. 'Tis the Irish vote, sir, that's the master, and we've got the newspapers. And where would the Republicans or the Democrats be without us? Tell me that I've ye place. In this old country the Irishman is a slave. In America he's the master, and every mother's son of them knows it. Ah, begob, sir, that's the place for a man. This old country isn't fit for a pig to live in. America's the place. You might bet your life on it, sir." And suddenly it occurred to Hector that he might gain some information even from this blathering fool. His thoughts had been running much on emigration during those lonely hours he had passed. If what he dreaded had really taken place, he would return no more to the lone moorlands and hills and lakes of Sutherlandshire. He would put the wide Atlantic between himself and certain memories. For him it would be Soraid Slan, Litier Mograid, a long farewell to Finnery. But at present the Irishman would not be questioned. The outflowing of his eloquence was not to be stopped. He was now dealing with the various classes and various institutions of Great Britain, on each of which he bestowed the same epithet, that of bloody. The government, the newspaper editors, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, the clergy, the judges, the employers of labour, all were of the same ensanguined hue, and all were equally doomed to perdition as soon as Ireland had taken up a proper and inevitable position in America. Moreover, the tall and silent Highlander, as he sat and gazed upon the frothing creature, as if he were some strange phenomenon, some incomprehensible freak of nature, could not but see that the man was perfectly in earnest. "Look what they did to John Mitchell! Look at that now, John Mitchell!" Hector had unfortunately never heard of John Mitchell, so he could not say anything. "Dying by the roadside, John Mitchell, to be left to die by the roadside. Oh, think of that now. What do you say to that now? John Mitchell being left to die by the roadside." There were sudden tears in the deep sunken grey eyes, and the Irishman made no concealment as he wiped them away with his red cotton handkerchief. "Well, I'm very sorry," Hector McIntyre replied in answer to this appeal, whoever he was. "But what could they have done for the poor man?" "They could have given him a place," the other retorted with a sudden blaze of anger. "All that John Mitchell wanted was a place. But they, ensanguined, government, what they do it? Oh, sir, they let him die by the roadside. John Mitchell, to die by the roadside." "Well, I am thinking," said the forester slowly, as was his way when he had to talk in English, "that if the government was to give places to all them that would like a place, why the whole country would be in the public service, and there would be no one left to till the land. And do they give you a place when you go to America?" "Ah, be gobbed, sir," said the Irishman with a shrewd twinkle in his eye. "We get our share." Hector could not make out whether his new acquaintance had been to Portray to say good-bye to some friends before he crossed the Atlantic, or whether he had been engaged in the Crofter agitation, which was then attracting attention in Skye. On this latter subject, Parry discoursed with a vehement volubility and a gay and audacious ignorance, but here Hector was on his own ground, and had to interfere. "I am thinking you will not be knowing much about it," he observed with a calm frankness. "The great Highland clearances, they were not made for deer at all. They were not made for sportsmen at all. They were made for sheep, as many a landlord knows to cost this day, when he has the sheep farms on his lands and cannot get them let. And the deer forests, they are the worst land in a country where the best land is poor, and if they were to be cut up into crofts tomorrow, there is not one crofter in 20 would be able to earn his living, even if he was to get the croft for no rent at all. Oh yes, I am as sorry as anyone for the poor people when they increase in their families on such poor land. But what would be the use of giving them more peat hogs and rocks? Can a man live where neither deer nor sheep nor black cattle can live? And even the deer come down in the winter and go wandering for miles in search of a blade of bent grass. However, the Irishman could not accept these representations in any wise. He suspected this grave brown-bearded Highlander of being an accomplice and hireling of the ensanguined landlords, and he might have gone on to denounce him, or even to provoke an appeal to fisticuffs, which would have been manifestly imprudent, had it not suddenly occurred to him that they might go down below and have a glass of whisky together. Hector saw him disappear into the fore-cabin by himself, and was perhaps glad to be left alone. Steadily, the great steamer clove her way upward by the islands of Raasay and Scalpa, through the narrows of Kyle O'Kane and Kyle Rhea, past the lighthouse and opening to Isle Orsney, and down toward the wooded shores of Armadale. The day was fair and still. The sea was of an almost summer-like blue, save for long swaths of silver calm. The sun shone on the lower green slopes that seemed so strangely voiceless, and on the higher peaks and shoulders of the hills, where every corrie and watercourse was a thread of azure among the ethereal rose-greys of the far-reaching summits. Even the wild Ardnamurchan, the headland of the great waves, had not a flake of cloud clinging to its beetle cliffs, and the long smooth roll that came in from the outer ocean was almost imperceptible. Toward evening the clansmen sailed into Oban Bay. The world seemed all on fire, so far as sea and sky were concerned, but Kerrera lay in shadow, a cold and livid green, while between the crimson water and crimson heavens stood the distant mountains of Moll, and they had grown to be of a pale, clear, transparent rose-purple. so that they seemed a mere film thinner than any isinglass. 5. There was abundance of time for him to go ashore and make inquiries, but nothing had been heard of Flora Campbell since she had left. However, he managed to get the address of her sister, Mary Campbell, and with that in his possession he returned on board. Thereafter the monotonous voyage was resumed, away down by the long peninsula of Kentire, and round the mole, up again through the estuary of the Clyde, until at 4 o'clock on the Friday afternoon the clansmen drew into Greenock Quay, and Hector McIntyre knew that within a few minutes he would learn what fate had in store for him for good or irretrievable ill. He found his way to the address that had been given him, a temperance hotel at which Mary Campbell was head laundry maid. But Mary Campbell was no longer there. She had been removed when she was taken ill, and as she would not go into a hospital, according to familiar prejudice amongst many of her class, lodgings had been found for her. Thither Hector went forthwith, to a slummy little by-street, where after many enquiries he found the land and the clothes that he sought. He ascended the grimy and dusky stone stairs. When he had nearly reached the top floor, he was met by a stout elderly man who had just shut a door behind him. "Is there one Mary Campbell living here?" he made bold to ask in English. "Aye, that there is," said the stranger, fixing keen eyes on him. "Are you come for news of her? I am the doctor." "Yes, yes," Hector said, but could say no more. His heart was beating like to choke him. He fixed his eyes on the doctor's face. "You'll be one of her Highland cousins, eh? You dinna look like a town-bred lad," said the brusque and burly doctor, with a sort of facetious good humour. Well, Mary is getting on right enough. You might as well go in and cheer her up a bit. The twa lasses dinna seem to have many friends." But Flora," said the forester, with his hungry, haggard eyes still watching every expression of the doctor's face. "The other one? Indeed, she has had the fever worse than her sister. I wasna sure one night but that she would go." McIntyre seemed to hear no more. Flora was alive, was within a few yards of him. He stood there quite dazed. His eyes were averted. He was breathing heavily. The doctor looked at him for a moment or two. "Maybe it's the sister you're anxious about," said he bluntly. "Well, she's no out of the wood yet, but she has a fair chance. What, man, what's the matter with ye? It's not such ill news." No, it's very good news," Hector said in an undertone as if to himself. "I was fearing something. Can I see the lass? I was not hearing from her for a while." But he could not explain what had brought him hither. He instinctively knew that this south countryman would laugh at his Highland superstition, would say that his head had been stuffed full of Halloween nonsense, or that at most what he had imagined he had seen, and the fact that Flora Campbell had fallen seriously ill formed but a mere coincidence. "Oh yes, you can see her," the doctor said with rough good nature, "but I'll just go in beforehand to give her a bit of warning. You can talk to her sister for a minute or two. She's sitting up now, and soon she'll have to begin and nurse her sister, as her sister did her until she took the fever. Come away, lad. What's your name, did you say?" "Hector McIntyre. Flora will know very well where I am from." The doctor knocked at the door, which was presently opened by a young girl, and while he left Hector to talk to the elder sister, who was lying propped up on a rude couch in a rather shabby little apartment, he himself went into an inner room. When he came out, he again looked at Hector curiously. "Now I understand why you were so anxious," said he with a familiar smile. "How came ye to hear she was ill? She says she did not want ye to ken anything about it until she was on the high road to getting better." Hector did not answer him. He only looked toward the door that had been partially left open. "Go in, then," said the doctor, "and dinna stay over long, my lad, for she has little strength to waste in talking as yet." Timidly, like a schoolboy, this big strong man entered the sick room, and it was gently and on tiptoe, lest his heavily nailed boots should make any noise, that he went forward to the bedside. Flora lay there, pale and emaciated, but there was a smile of surprise and a welcome in the dark blue Highland eyes, and she tried to lift her wasted hand to meet his. What they had to say to each other was said in the Gaelic tongue. "It is sorry I am to say you like this," said he, sitting down and keeping her hand in his own, "but the doctor says you are now in a fair way to get better, and it is not from this town I am going until I take you with me. Flora, girl of my heart, the Sutherland air will be better for you than the Greenock air, and your sister Mary will come with you for a while, and both of you will take my little cottage, and Mrs. Matheson will give me a bed at Achnavel Lodge. I am sure Mr. Lennox would not object to that."
"But Hector, how did he know that I was ill?"
the sick girl said, and her eyes did not leave his eyes for a moment.
"I was not wishing you to know I was ill, to give you trouble, till I could write to you that I was better."
"How did I know?" he answered gravely. "It was you yourself who came to tell me."
"What is it that you say, Hector?"
she said, in some vague alarm. "On Halloween night," he continued, in the same serious, simple tones, "I was at Invermoodal. Perhaps I was not caring much for the diversions of the lads and lasses. I walked up the road by myself, and there your wraith appeared to me as clear as I see you now. When I went back and told Mr. Murray, he said, 'Did she come forward to you, Hector, or did she go away? She is in great danger. It is a warning, and if she went away from you, you will see her no more. But if she came forward, she is getting better. You will see Flora again.' I knew that myself, but I could not answer him, and my heart said to me that I must find out for myself, that I must go to seek you, and I set out that night and walked across the Ray Forest to Loch Inver, and caught the steamer there. What I have been thinking since I left Loch Inver until this hour, I cannot tell you or to anyone living."
"Hector,"
she asked,
"what night was Halloween night? I have not been thinking of such things."
"It was the night of Tuesday," he answered.
"And that,"
she said in a low voice,
"was the night that my fever took the turn.
Mary told me they did not expect me to be alive in the morning." "We will never speak of it again, Flora," said he, "for there are things that we do not understand." And then he added, "But now that I am in Greenock, it is in Greenock I mean to remain until I can take you away with me, and Mary too, for Sutherland air is better than Greenock air for a Highland lass. And sure I am that Mr. Lennox will not grudge me having a bed at Achnavel Lodge, and you will get familiar with the cottage, Flora, where I hope you will soon be mistress, and then there will be no more occasion for a great distance between you and me, or for the strange things that sometimes happen when people are separated the one from the other." End of The Halloween Wraith by William Black, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.
There was no use hiding from the truth. Somebody had blundered, a fatal blunder, and they were going to pay for it. Mark Forepaugh kicked the pile of hydrogen cylinders. Only a moment ago he had broken the seals, the mendacious seals that certified to the world that the flasks were fully charged, and the flasks were empty. The supply of this precious power gas, which in an emergency should have been sufficient for 6 years, simply did not exist. He walked over to the integrating machine, which as early as the year 2031 had begun to replace the older atomic processes, due to the shortage of the radium series metals. It was bulky and heavy compared to the atomic disintegrators, but it was much more economical and very dependable. Dependable, provided some thick-headed stock clerk at a terrestrial supply station did not check in empty hydrogen cylinders instead of full ones. Forepaugh's unwanted curses brought a smile to the stupid, good-natured face of his servant Gunga, who had been banished for life from his native Mars for his impiety in closing his single round eye during the sacred ceremony of the wells. The Earthman was at this steaming hot, unhealthful trading station under the very shadow of the south pole of the minor planet Inra for an entirely different reason. One of the most popular of his set on the Earth, an athletic hero, he had fallen in love, and the devoutly wished-for marriage was only prevented by lack of funds. The opportunity to take charge of this richly paid, though dangerous outpost of civilization had been no sooner offered than taken. In another week or two, the relief ship was due to take him and his valuable collection of exotic Iranian orchids back to the Earth, back to a fat bonus, constants, and an assured future. It was a different young man who now stood tragically before the useless power plant. His slim body was bowed, and his clean features were drawn. Grimly, he raked the cooling dust that had been forced in the integrating chamber by the electronic rearrangement of the original hydrogen atoms, finely powdered iron and silicon, the ashes of the last tank of hydrogen. Gunga chuckled. "What's the matter?" Forepaugh barked. "Going crazy already?" "Me haw, me thinkin'," Gunga rumbled. "Haw, we got plenty hydrogen." He pointed to the low metal roof of the trading station. Though it was well insulated against sound, the place continually vibrated to the low murmur of the Iranian rains that fell interminably through the perpetual polar day. It was a rain such as is never seen on Earth, even in the tropics. It came in drops as large as a man's fist. It came in streams. It came in large, shattering masses that broke before they fell and filled the air with spray. There was little wind, but the steady green downpour of water and the brilliant continuous flashing of lightning shamed the dull, soggy twilight produced by the large, hot, but hidden sun. "Your idea of a joke," Forepaugh growled in disgust. He understood what Gunga's grin pleasantly referred to. There was, indeed, an incalculable quantity of hydrogen at hand. If some means could be found to separate the hydrogen atoms from the oxygen in the world of water around them, they would not lack for fuel. He thought of electrolysis, and relaxed with a sigh. There was no power. The generators were dead. The air dryer and cooler had ceased its rhythmic pulsing nearly an hour ago. Their lights were gone, and the automatic radio utterly useless. "This is what comes of putting all your eggs in one basket," he thought, and let his mind dwell vindictively on the engineers who had designed the equipment on which his life depended. An exclamation from Gunga startled him. The Martian was pointing to the ventilator opening, the only part of this strange building that was not hermetically sealed against the hostile life of Inra. A dark rim had appeared at its margin, a loathsome black-green rim that was moving, spreading out. It crept over the metal walls like the low-lying smoke of a fire, yet it was a solid. From it emanated a strong miasmatic odor. "The giant mold!" Forepaugh cried. He rushed to his desk and took out his flash pistol, quickly set the localizer so as to cover a large area. When he turned, he saw, to his horror, Gunga about to smash into the mold with his axe. He sent the man spinning with a blow to his ear. "Want to scatter it and start it growing in a half-dozen places?" he snapped. "Here!" He pulled the trigger. There was a light, spiteful ping, and for an instant a cone of white light stood out in the dim room like a solid thing. Then it was gone, and with it was gone the black mold, leaving a circular area of blistered paint on the wall and an acrid odor in the air. Forepaugh leaped to the ventilating louver and closed it tightly. "It's going to be like this from now on," he remarked to the shaken Gunga. "All these things that wouldn't bother us as long as the machinery kept the building dry and cool. They couldn't live in here, but it's getting damp and hot. Look at the moisture condensing on the ceiling." Gunga gave a guttural cry of despair. "It knows, boss. Look!" Through one of the round, heavily framed ports it could be seen, the lower part of its large, shapeless body, half floating in the lashing water that covered their rocky shelf to a depth of several feet, the other part spectral and gray. It was a giant amoeba, fully 6 feet in diameter and in its present spheroid form, but capable of assuming any shape that would be useful. It had an envelope of tough, transparent matter, and was filled with a fluid that was now cloudy and then clear. Near the center there was a mass of darker matter, and this was undoubtedly the seat of its intelligence. The Earthman recoiled in horror. A single cell with a brain! It was unthinkable. It was a biological nightmare. Never before had he seen one, had, in fact, dismissed the stories of the Iranian natives as a bit of primitive superstition, had laughed at these gentle, stupid amphibians with whom he traded, when they, in their imperfect language, tried to tell him of it. They had called it the Ul-Lul. Well, let it be so. It was an amoeba, and it was watching him. It floated in the downpour and watched him. With what? It had no eyes. No matter, it was watching him. And then it suddenly flowed outward until it became a disk rocking on the waves. Again its fluid form changed, and by a series of elongations and contractions, it flowed through the water at an incredible speed. It came straight for the window, struck the thick, unbreakable glass with a shock that could be felt by the men inside. It flowed over the glass and over the building. It was trying to eat them, building and all. The part of its body over the port became so thin that it was almost invisible. At last, its absolute limit reached, it dropped away baffled, vanishing amid the glare of the lightning and the frothing waters like the shadows of a nightmare. The heat was intolerable, and the air was bad. "Oh, we have to open ventilator, boss," gasped the Martian. Forepaugh nodded grimly. It wouldn't do to smother either. Though to open the ventilator would be to invite another invasion by the black mold, not to mention the amoebae and other fabulous monsters that had up to now been kept at a safe distance by the repeller zone, a simple adaptation of a very old discovery. A zone of mechanical vibrations, of a frequency of 500,000 cycles per second, was created by a large quartz crystal in the water, which was electrically operated. Without power, the protective zone had vanished. "We watch?" asked Gunga. "You bet we watch, every minute of the day and night." He examined the two chronometers, assuring himself that they were well wound, and congratulated himself that they were not dependent on the defunct power plant for energy. They were his only means of measuring the passage of time. The sun, which theoretically would seem to travel round and round the horizon, had rarely succeeded in making its exact location known, but appeared to shift strangely from side to side at the whim of the fog and water. "The fellas," Gunga remarked, coming out of a study, "why not come?" He referred to the Iranians. "Probably know something's wrong. They can tell the quartz oscillator is stopped. Afraid of the Ul-Lul, I suppose." "Square," demurred the Martian. "Ul-Lul not bother fellows." "You mean it doesn't follow them into the underbrush. But it would find tough going there. Not enough water. Trees there, 400 feet high, with thorny roots and rough bark. They wouldn't like that. Oh no, these natives ought to be pretty snug in their dens. Why, they're as hard to catch as a muskrat. Don't know what a muskrat is, huh? Well, it's the same as the Iranians, only different, and not so ugly." For the next 6 days they existed in their straitened quarters, one guarding while the other slept. But such alarms as they experienced were of a minor nature, easily disposed of by their flash pistol. It had not been intended for continuous service, and under the frequent drains it showed an alarming loss of power. Forepaugh repeatedly warned Gunga to be more sparing in its use, but that worthy persisted in his practice of using it against every trifling invasion of the poisonous Iranian cave moss that threatened them, or the warm, soggy water spiders that hopefully explored the ventilator shaft in search of living food. "Bash him with a broom or something. Never mind if it isn't nice. Save our flash gun for something bigger." Gunga only looked distressed. On the 7th day, their position became untenable. Some kind of sea creature, hidden under the ever-replenished storm waters, had found the concrete emplacements of their trading post to its liking. Just how it was done was never learned. It is doubtful that the creatures could gnaw away the solid stone. More likely, the process was chemical, but nonetheless it was effective. The foundations crumbled, the metal shell subsided, rolled half over so that silty water leaked in through the straining seams, and threatened at any moment to be buffeted and urged away on the surface of the flood toward that distant vast sea which covers 9/10 of the area of Inra. "Time to mush for the mountains," Forepaugh decided. Gunga grinned. The Mountains of Perdition were, to his point of view, the only part of Inra even remotely inhabitable. They were sometimes fairly cool, and though perpetually pelted with rain, blazing with lightning and reverberating with thunder, they had caves that were fairly dry and too cool for the black mold. Sometimes, under favorable circumstances, on their rugged peaks, one could get the full benefit of the enormous hot sun for whose actinic rays the Martian-starved system yearned. "Better pack a few cans of the food tablets," the white man ordered. "Take a couple of waterproof sleeping bags for us and a few hundred fire pellets. You can have the flash pistol. It may have a few more charges in it." Forepaugh broke the glass case marked "Emergency Only" and removed 2 more flash pistols. Well, he knew that he would need them after passing beyond the trading area, perhaps sooner. His eyes fell on his personal chest, and he opened it for a brief examination. None of the contents seemed of any value, and he was about to pass when he dragged out a long, heavy, .45 caliber six-shooter in a holster and a cartridge belt filled with shells. The Martian stared. "Know what it is?" his master asked, handing him the weapon. Gunga not know. He took it and examined it curiously. It was a fine museum piece in an excellent state of preservation, the metal overlaid with the patina of age, but free from rust and corrosion. "It's a weapon of the ancients," Forepaugh explained. "It was a sort of family heirloom and is over 300 years old. One of my grandfathers used it in the famous Northwest Mounted Police. Wonder if it'll shoot." He leveled the weapon at a flat, sightless wriggler that came squirming through a seam, squinting unaccustomed eyes along the barrel. There was a violent explosion, and the wriggler disappeared in a smear of dirty green. Gunga nearly fell over backward in fright, and even Forepaugh was shaken. He was surprised that the ancient cartridge had exploded at all, though he knew powder-making had reached a high level of perfection before explosive chemical weapons had yielded to the newer, lighter, and infinitely more powerful ray weapons. The gun would impede their progress. It would be of very little use against the giant carnivora of Inra. Yet something, perhaps a sentimental attachment, perhaps what his ancestors would have called a hunch, compelled him to strap it around his waist. He carefully packed a few essentials in his knapsack, together with 1 chronometer and a tiny gyroscopic compass. So equipped, they could travel with a fair degree of precision toward the mountains some 100 miles on the other side of a steaming forest, acrawl with feral life and hot with bloodlust. Man and master descended into the warm waters, and without a backward glance left the trading post to its fate. There was not even any use in leaving a note. Their relief ship, soon due, would never find the station without radio direction. The current was strong, but the water gradually became shallower as they ascended the sloping rock. After half an hour, they saw ahead of them the loom of the forest, and with some trepidation they entered the gloom cast by the towering, fern-like trees, whose tops disappeared in murky fog. Tangled vines impeded their progress. Quagmires lay in wait for them, and tough weeds tripped them, sometimes throwing one or another into the mud among squirming small reptiles that lashed at them with spiked, poisonous feet and then fell to pieces, each piece to lie in the bubbling ooze until it grew again into a whole animal. Several times they almost walked under the bodies of great spheroid creatures with massive short legs, whose tremendously long sinuous necks disappeared in the leaky murk above, swaying gently like long-stalked lilies in a terrestrial pond. These were Azarnaks, mild-tempered vegetarians whose only defense lay in their thick, blubbery hides. Filled with parasites, stinking and rancid, their decaying covering of fat effectively concealed the tender flesh underneath, protecting them from fangs and rending claws. Deeper in the forest, the battering of the rain was mitigated. Giant neo-palm leaves formed a roof that shut out not only most of the weak daylight, but also the fury of the downpour. The water collected in cataracts, ran down the boles of the trees, and roared through the semicircular canals of the snake trees, so named by early explorers for their waving, rubbery tentacles, multiplied a millionfold, that performed the duties of leaves. Water gurgled and chuckled everywhere, spread in vast dim ponds and lakes, writhing with tormented roots, upheaved by unseen, uncatalogued leviathans, rippled by translucent disks of loathsome, luminescent jelly that quivered from place to place in pursuit of microscopic prey. Yet the impression was one of calm and quiet, and the waifs from other worlds felt a surcease of nervous tension. Unconsciously, they relaxed. Taking their bearings, they changed their course slightly for the nesting place of the nearest tribe of Inranians, where they hoped to get food and at least partial shelter. For their food tablets had mysteriously turned to an unpleasant viscous liquid, and their sleeping bags were alive with giant bacteria easily visible to the eye. They were doomed to disappointment. After nearly 12 hours of desperate struggling through the morass, through gloomy aisles and countless narrow escapes from prowling beasts of prey in which only the speed and tremendous power of their flash pistols saved them from instant death, they reached a rocky outcropping which led to the comparatively dry rise of land on which a tribe of Inranians made its home. Their faces were covered with welts made by the hanging filaments of blood-sucking trees as fine as spider webs, and their senses reeled with the oppressive stench of the abysmal jungle. If the pampered ladies of the inner planets only knew where their $1,000 orchids sprang from. Converging runways showed the opening of one of the underground dens, almost hidden from view by a bewildering maze of roots, rendered more formidable by long, sharp stakes made from the iron-hard thigh bones of the flying cabo. Forepaugh cupped his hands over his mouth and gave the call. "Auf, auf, 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 auf!" He repeated it over and over, the jungle giving back his voice in a muffled echo, while Gunga held a spare flash pistol and kept a sharp lookout for a carnivore intent on getting an unwary Inranian. There was no answer. These timid creatures, who were often rated the most intelligent life native to primitive Inra, had sensed disaster and had fled. Forepaugh and Gunga slept in one of the foul, poorly ventilated dens, ate of the hard, woody tubers that had not been worth taking along, and wished they had a certain stock clerk at that place at that time. They were awakened out of deep slumber by the threshing of an evil-looking creature, which had become entangled among the sharpened spikes. Its tremendous maw, splitting it almost in half, was opened in roars of pain that showed great yellow fangs 8 inches in length. Its heavy flippers battered the stout roots and lacerated themselves in the beast's insensate rage. It was quickly dispatched with a flash pistol, and Gunga cooked himself some of the meat using a fire pellet. But despite his hunger, Forepaugh did not dare eat any of it, knowing that this species, strange to him, might easily be one of the many on Inra that are poisonous to terrestrials. They resumed their march toward the distant invisible mountains, and were fortunate in finding somewhat better footing than they had on their previous march. They covered about 25 miles on that day, without untoward incident. Their ray pistols gave them an insuperable advantage over the largest and most ferocious beasts they could expect to meet, so that they became more and more confident, despite the knowledge that they were rapidly using up the energy stored in their weapons. The first one had long ago been discarded, and the charge indicators of the other 2 were approaching 0 at a disquieting rate. Forepaugh took them both, and from that time on he was careful never to waste a discharge except in case of a direct and unavoidable attack. This often entailed long waits or stealthy detours through sucking mud, and came near to ending both their lives. The Earthman was in the lead when it happened. Seeking an uncertain footing through a tangle of low-growing, thick, ghastly white vegetation, he placed a foot on what seemed to be a broad, flat rock, projecting slightly above the ooze. Instantly, there was a violent upheaval of mud. The seeming rock flew up like a trapdoor, disclosing a cavernous mouth some 7 feet across, and a thick, triangular tentacle flew up from its concealment in the mud in a vicious arc. Forepaugh leaped back barely in time to escape being swept in and engulfed. The end of the tentacle struck him a heavy blow on the chest, throwing him back with such force as to bowl Gunga over, and whirling the pistols out of his hands into a slimy, bulbous growth nearby, where they stuck in the phosphorescent cavities the force of their impact had made. There was no time to recover the weapons. With a bellow of rage, the beast was out of its bed and rushing at them. Nothing stayed its progress. Tough, heavily scaled trees, thicker than a man's body, shuddered and fell as its bulk brushed by them. But it was momentarily confused, and its first rush carried it past its dodging quarry. This momentary respite saved their lives. Rearing its plumed head to awesome heights, its knobby bark running with brown rivulets of water, a giant tree, even for the world of giants, offered refuge. The men scrambled up the rough trunk easily, finding plenty of hand and footholds. They came to rest on one of the shelf-like circumvoluting rings, some 25 feet above the ground. Soon the blunt brown tentacle slithered in search of them, but failed to reach their refuge by inches. And now began the most terrible siege that interlopers in that primitive world can endure. From that cavernous, distended throat came a tremendous, world-shaking noise. Whoom, 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 whoom. Forepaugh put his hand to his head. It made him dizzy. He had not believed that such noise could be. He knew that no creature could long live amidst it. He tore strips from his shredded clothing and stuffed his ears, but felt no relief. Whoom, 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 whoom. It throbbed in his brain. Gunga lay asprawl, staring with fascinated eye into the pulsating scarlet gullet that was blasting the world with sound. Slowly, slowly, he was slipping. His master hauled him back. The Martian grinned at him stupidly, slid again to the edge. Once more, Forepaugh pulled him back. The Martian seemed to acquiesce. His single eye closed to a mere slit. He moved to a position between Forepaugh and the tree trunk, braced his feet. "No, you don't." The Earthman laughed uproariously. The din was making him light-headed. It was so funny. Just in time, he had caught that cunning expression and prepared for the outlashing of feet, designed to plunge him into the red cavern below and to stop that hellish racket. And now he swung his fist heavily, slamming the Martian against the tree. The red eye closed wearily. He was unconscious and lucky. Hungrily, the Earthman stared at his distant flash pistols, plainly visible in the luminescence of their fungus bedding. He began a slow, cautious creep along the top of a vine some 8 inches thick. If he could reach them— Crash! He was almost knocked to the ground by the thud of a frantic tentacle against the vine. His movement had been seen. Again the tentacle struck with crushing force. The great vine swayed. He managed to reach the shelf again in the very nick of time. Whoom, 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 whoom. A bolt of lightning struck a giant fern some distance away. The crash of thunder was hardly noticeable. Forepaugh wondered if his tree would be struck. Perhaps it might even start a fire, giving him a flaming brand with which to torment his tormentor. Vain hope. The wood was saturated with moisture. Even the fire pellets could not make it burn. Whoom, 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 whoom. Home, home. The six-shooter. He had forgotten it. He jerked it from its holster and pointed it at the red throat, emptied all the chambers. He saw the flash of yellow flame, felt the recoil, but the sound of the discharges was drowned in the Brobdingnagian tumult. He drew back his arm to throw the useless toy from him, but again that unexplainable, senseless hunch restrained him. He reloaded the gun and returned it to its holster. Home, 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 home. A thought had been struggling to reach his consciousness against the pressure of the unbearable noise. The fire pellets. Couldn't they be used in some way? The small chemical spheres, no larger than the end of his little finger, had long ago supplanted actual fire along the frontiers, where electricity was not available for cooking. In contact with moisture, they emitted terrific heat, a radiant heat which penetrated meat, bone, and even metal. One such pellet would cook a meal in 10 minutes, with no sign of scorching or burning, and they had several hundred in one of the standard moisture-proof containers. As fast as his fingers could work the trigger of the dispenser, Forepaugh dropped the potent little pellets down the bellowing throat. He managed to release about 30 before the bellowing stopped. A veritable tornado of energy broke loose at the foot of the tree. The giant maw was closed, and the shocking silence was broken only by the thrashing of a giant body in its death agonies. The radiant heat, penetrating through and through the beast's body, withered nearby vegetation, and could be easily felt on the perch up the tree. Gunga was slowly recovering. His iron constitution helped him to rally from the powerful blow he had received, and by the time the jungle was still, he was sitting up mumbling apologies. "Never mind," said his master. "Shin down there and cut us off a good helping of roast tongue, if it has a tongue, before something else comes along and beats us out of a feast." "Him poison, maybe," Gunga demurred. They had killed a specimen new to zoologists. "Might as well die of poison as starvation," Forepaugh countered. Without more ado, the Martian descended, cut out some large, juicy chunks as his fancy dictated, and brought his loot back up the tree. The meat was delicious and apparently wholesome. They gorged themselves and threw away what they could not eat, for food spoils very quickly in the Iranian jungles, and uneaten meat would only serve to attract hordes of the gauzy-winged, glutinous Iranian swamp flies. As they sank into slumber, they could hear the beginning of a bedlam of snarling and fighting, as the lesser carnivora fed on the body of the fallen giant. When they awoke, the chronometer recorded the passing of 12 hours, and they had to tear a network of strong fibers, with which the tree had invested them preparatory to absorbing their bodies as food. For so keen is the competition for life on Inra that practically all vegetation is capable of absorbing animal food directly. Many an Iranian explorer can tell tales of narrow escapes from some of the more specialized flesh-eating plants, but they are now so well known that they are easily avoided. A clean-picked framework of crushed and broken giant bones was all that was left of the late bellowing monster. 6-legged water dogs were polishing them hopefully, or delving into them with their long, sinuous snouts for the marrow. The Earthman fired a few shots with his six-shooter, and they scattered, dragging the bodies of their fallen companions to a safe distance to be eaten. Only one of the flash pistols was in working order. The other had been trampled by heavy hoofs and was useless. A heavy handicap under which to traverse 50 miles of abysmal jungle. They started with nothing for breakfast except water, of which they had plenty. Fortunately, the outcroppings of rocks and gravel washes were becoming more and more frequent, and they were able to travel at much better speed. As they left the low-lying jungle land, they entered a zone which was faintly reminiscent of a terrestrial jungle. It was still hot, soggy, and fetid, but gradually the most primitive aspects of the scene were modified. The overarching trees were less closely packed, and they came across occasional rock clearings which were bare of vegetation except for a dense carpet of brown, lichen-like vegetation that secreted an astonishing amount of juice. They slipped and sloshed through this, rousing swarms of odd, toothed birds, which darted angrily around their heads and slashed at them with the razor-sharp saw edges on the back of their legs. Annoying as they were, they could be kept away with branches torn from trees, and their presence connoted an absence of the deadly jungle flesh-eaters, permitting a temporary relaxation of vigilance and saving the resources of the last flash gun. They camped that night on the edge of one of these rock clearings. For the first time in weeks it had stopped raining, although the sun was still obscured. Dimly on the horizon could be seen the first of the foothills. Here they gathered some of the giant oblong fungus that early explorers had taken for blocks of porous stone because of their size and weight, and by dint of the plentiful application of fire pellets managed to set it ablaze. The heat added nothing to their comfort, but it dried them out and allowed them to sleep unmolested. An unwary winged eel served as their breakfast, and soon they were on their way to those beckoning hills. It had started to rain again, but the worst part of their journey was over. If they could reach the top of one of the mountains, there was a good chance that they would be seen and rescued by their relief ship, provided they did not starve first. The flyer would use the mountains as a base from which to search for the trading station, and it was conceivable that the skipper might actually have anticipated their desperate adventure and would look for them in the mountains of perdition. They had crossed several ranges of the foothills and were beginning to congratulate themselves when the diffused light from above was suddenly blotted out. It was raining again, and above the echo-augmented thunder they heard a shrill screeching. "A web serpent!" Gunga cried, throwing himself flat on the ground. Forepaugh eased into a rock cleft at his side, just in time. A great grotesque head bore down upon him, many-fanged as a medieval dragon. Between obsidian eyes was a fissure whence emanated a wailing and foul odor. Hundreds of short, clawed legs slithered on the rocks under a long, sinuous body. Then it seemed to leap into the air again. Webs grew taut between the legs, strumming as they caught a strong uphill wind. Again it turned to the attack and missed them. This time Forepaugh was ready for it. He shot at it with his flash pistol. Nothing happened. The fog made accurate shooting impossible, and the gun lacked its former power. The web serpent continued to course back and forth over their heads. "Guess we'd better run for it," Forepaugh murmured. "Go ahead." They cautiously left their places of concealment. Instantly the serpent was down again, persistent if inaccurate. It struck the place of their first concealment and missed them. "Run!" They extended their weary muscles to the utmost, but it was soon apparent that they could not escape long. A rock wall in their path saved them. "Hole!" the Martian gasped. Forepaugh followed him into the rocky cleft. There was a strong draught of dry air, and it would have been next to impossible to hold the Martian back, so Forepaugh allowed him to lead on toward the source of the draught. As long as it led into the mountains, he didn't care. The natural passageway was untenanted. Evidently, its coolness and dryness made it untenable for most of Inra's humidity and heat-loving life. Yet the floor was so smooth that it must have been artificially leveled. Faint illumination was provided by the rocks themselves. They appeared to be covered by some microscopic phosphorescent vegetation. After hundreds of twists and turns and interminable straight galleries, the cleft turned more sharply upward, and they had a period of stiff climbing. They must have gone several miles and climbed at least 20,000 feet. The air became noticeably thin, which only exhilarated Gunga, but slowed the Earthman down. But at last they came to the end of the cleft. They could go no further, but above them, at least 500 feet higher, they saw a round patch of sky, miraculously bright blue sky. "A pipe!" Forepaugh cried. He had often heard of these mysterious, almost fabulous structures sometimes reported by passing travelers. Straight and true, smooth as glass and apparently immune to the elements, they had been occasionally seen standing on the very tops of the highest mountains, seen for a few moments only before they were hidden again by the clouds. Were they observatories of some ancient race, placed thus to pierce the mysteries of outer space? They would find out. The inside of the pipe had zigzagging rings of metal, conveniently spaced for easy climbing. With Gunga leading, they soon reached the top, but not quite. "Eh?" said Forepaugh. "Huh?" said Gunga. There had not been a sound, but a distinct, definite command had registered on their minds. "Stop!" They tried to climb higher, but could not unclasp their hands. They tried to descend, but could not lower their feet. The light was by now relatively bright, and as by command their eyes sought the opposite wall. What they saw gave their jaded nerves an unpleasant thrill. A mass of doughy matter of a blue-green color, about 3 feet in diameter, with something that resembled a cyst filled with transparent liquid near its center. And this thing began to flow along the rods, much as tar flows. From the mass extended a pseudopod, touched Gunga on the arm. Instantly, the arm was raw and bleeding. Terrified, immovable, he writhed in agony. The pseudopod returned to the main mass, disappearing into its interior with the strip of bloody skin. Its attention was centered so much on the luckless Martian that its control slipped from Forepaugh. Seizing his flash pistol, he set the localized for a small area and aimed it at the thing, intent on burning it into nothingness. But again his hand was stayed. Against the utmost of his willpower, his fingers opened, letting the pistol drop. The liquid in the cyst danced and bubbled. Was it laughing at him? It had read his mind, thwarted his will again. Again a pseudopod stretched out, and a strip of raw, red flesh adhered to it and was consumed. Mad rage convulsed the Earthman. Should he throw himself tooth and nail on the monster, and be engulfed? He thought of the six-shooter. It thrilled him. But wouldn't it make him drop that, too? A flash of atavistic cunning came to him. He began to reiterate in his mind a certain thought. "This thing is so I can see you better. This thing is so I can see you better." He said it over and over, with all the passion and devotion of a celibate's prayer over a uranium fountain. "This thing is harmless, but it will make me see you better." Slowly, he drew the six-shooter. In some occult way, he knew it was watching him. "Oh, this is harmless. This is an instrument to aid my weak eyes. It will help me realize your mastery. This will enable me to know your true greatness. This will enable me to know you as a god." Was it complacence or suspicion that stirred the liquid in the cyst so smoothly? Was it susceptible to flattery? He sighted along the barrel. "In another moment, your great intelligence will overwhelm me," proclaimed his surface mind desperately, while the subconscious tensed the trigger. And at that, the clear liquid burst into a turmoil of alarm. Too late. Forepaugh went limp, but not before he had loosed a steel-jacketed bullet that shattered the mind cyst of the pipe denizen. A horrible pain coursed through his every fiber and nerve. He was safe in the arms of Gunga, being carried to the top of the pipe to the clean, dry air and the blessed, blistering sun. The pipe denizen was dying. A viscous, inert mass, it dropped lower and lower, lost contact at last, shattered into slime at the bottom. Miraculous sun! For a luxurious 15 minutes they roasted there on the top of the pipe. the only solid thing in a sea of clouds as far as the eye could reach. But no, there was a circular spot against the brilliant white of the clouds, and it was rapidly coming closer. In a few minutes it resolved itself into the Comet, fast relief ship of the terrestrial, Iranian, Janidian, and Zydian Lines, Inc. With a low buzz of her repulsion motors, she drew alongside. Hooks were attached and ports opened. A petty officer and a crew of roustabouts made her fast. "What the hell's going on here?" asked the cocky little terrestrial who was skipper, stepping out and surveying the castaways. "We've been looking for you ever since your directional wave failed. But come on in, come on in." He led the way to his stateroom while the ship's surgeon took Gunga in charge. Closing the door carefully, he delved into the bottom of his locker and brought out a flask. "Can't be too careful," he remarked, filling a small tumbler for himself and another for his guest. "Always apt to be some snooper to report me. But say, you're wanted in the radio room." "Radio room nothing. When do we eat?" "Right away. But you'd better see him. Fellow from the Interplanetary News Agency wants you to broadcast a copyrighted story. Good for about 3 years' salary, old boy." "All right, I'll see him," with a happy sigh. "Just as soon as I put through a personal message." He sat in a small, half-darkened booth, well over in the corner, the man with the strangely glowing blue-green eyes. The booth was one of a score that circled the walls of the Maori Hut, a popular nightclub in the San Fernando Valley, some 5 miles over the hills from Hollywood. It was nearly midnight. Half a dozen couples danced lazily in the central dancing space. Other couples remained tete-a-tete in the secluded booths. In the entire room, only 2 men were dining alone. One was the slender, gray-haired little man with the weirdly glowing eyes. The other was Blair Gordon, a highly successful young attorney of Los Angeles. Both men had the unmistakable air of waiting for someone. Blair Gordon's college days were not so far distant that he had yet lost any of the splendid physique that had made him an all-American tackle. In any physical combat with the slight gray-haired stranger, Gordon knew that he should be able to break the other in 2 with one hand. Yet, as he studied the stranger from behind the potted palms that screened his own booth, Gordon was amazed to find himself slowly being overcome by an emotion of dread so intense that it verged upon sheer fear. There was something indescribably alien and utterly sinister in that dimly seen figure in the corner booth. The faint, eerie light that glowed in the stranger's deep-set eyes was not the lambent flame seen in the chatoyant orbs of some night-prowling jungle beast. Rather, it was the blue-green glow of phosphorescent witch-light that flickers and dances in the night mists above steaming tropical swamps. The stranger's face was as classically perfect in its rugged outline as that of a Roman war god, yet those perfect features seemed utterly lifeless. In the 20 minutes that he had been intently watching the stranger, Gordon would have sworn that the other's face had not moved by so much as the twitch of an eyelash. Then a new couple entered the Maori hut, and Gordon promptly forgot all thought of the puzzling alien figure in the corner. The new arrivals were a vibrantly beautiful blonde girl and a plump, sallow-faced man in the early 40s. The girl was Leah Keith, Hollywood's latest screen sensation. The man was Dave Redding, her director. A waiter seated Leah and her escort in a booth directly across the room from that of Gordon. It was a maneuver for which Gordon had tipped lavishly when he first came to the hut. A week ago, Leah Keith's engagement to Blair Gordon had been abruptly ended by a trivial little quarrel that the 2 volatile temperaments had fanned into flames which apparently made reconciliation impossible. A miserably lonely week had finally ended in Gordon's present trip to the Maori hut. He knew that Leah often came there, and he had an overwhelming longing to at least see her again, even though his pride forced him to remain unseen. Now, as he stared glumly at Leah through the palms that effectively screened his own booth, Gordon heartily regretted that he had ever come. The sight of Leah's clear, fresh beauty merely made him realize what a fool he had been to let that ridiculous little quarrel come between them. Then, with a sudden tingling thrill, Gordon realized that he was not the only one in the room who was interested in Leah and her escort. Over in the half-darkened corner booth, the eerie stranger was staring at the girl with an intentness that made his weird eyes glow like miniature pools of shimmering blue-green fire. Again, Gordon felt that vague impression of dread, as though he were in the presence of something utterly alien to all human experience. Gordon turned his gaze back to Leah, then caught his breath sharply in sudden amaze. The necklace about Leah's throat was beginning to glow with the same uncanny blue-green light that shone in the stranger's eyes. Faint, yet unmistakable, the shimmering radiance pulsed from the necklace in an aura of nameless evil. And with the coming of that aura of weird light at her throat, a strange trance was swiftly sweeping over Leah. She sat there now as rigidly motionless as some exquisite statue of ivory and jet. Gordon stared at her in stark bewilderment. He knew the history of Leah's necklace. It was merely an oddity, and nothing more. A freak piece of costume jewelry made from fragments of an Arizona meteorite. Leah had worn the necklace a dozen times before, without any trace of the weird phenomena that were now occurring. Dancers again thronged the floor to the blaring jazz of the Negro Orchestra, while Gordon was still trying to force his whirling brain to a decision. He was certain that Leah was in deadly peril of some kind, yet the nature of that peril was too bizarre for his mind to imagine. Then the stranger with the glowing eyes took matters into his own hands. He left his booth and began threading his way through the dancers toward Leah. As he watched the progress of that slight, gray-haired figure, Gordon refused to believe the evidence of his own eyes. The thing was too utterly absurd. Yet Gordon was positive that the strong oak floor of the dancing space was visibly swaying and creaking beneath the stranger's mincing tread. The stranger paused at Leah's booth only long enough to utter a brief, low-voiced command. Then Leah, still in the grip of that strange trance, rose obediently from her seat to accompany him. Dave Redding rose angrily to intercept her. The stranger seemed to barely brush the irate director with his fingertips, yet Redding reeled back as though struck by a pile-driver. Leah and the stranger started for the door. Redding scrambled to his feet again and hurried after them. It was then that Gordon finally shook off the stupor of utter bewilderment that had held him. Springing from his booth, he rushed after the trio. The dancers in his way delayed Gordon momentarily. Leah and the stranger were already gone when he reached the door. The narrow little entrance hallway to the hut was deserted, save for a figure sprawled there on the floor near the outer door. It was the body of Dave Redding. Gordon shuddered as he glanced briefly down at the huddled figure. A single mighty blow from some unknown weapon had crumpled the director's entire face in, like the shattered shell of a broken egg. Gordon charged on through the outer door just as a heavy sedan came careening out of the parking lot. He had a flashing glimpse of Leah and the stranger in the front seat of the big car. Gordon raced for his own machine, a powerful, low-slung roadster. A single vicious jab at the starting button, and the big motor leaped into roaring life. Gordon shot out from the parking lot onto the main boulevard. 100 yards away, the sedan was fleeing toward Hollywood. Gordon tramped hard on the accelerator. The engine snarled with the unleashed fury of 100 horsepower. The gap between the two cars swiftly lessened. Then the stranger seemed to become aware for the first time that he was being followed. The next second, the big sedan accelerated with the hurtling speed of a flying bullet. Gordon sent his own foot nearly to the floor. The roadster jumped to 80 miles an hour, yet the sedan continued to leave it remorselessly behind. The two cars started up the northern slope of Cahuenga Pass, with the sedan nearly 200 yards ahead and gaining all the time. Gordon wondered briefly if they were to flash down to the other side of the pass and on into Hollywood at their present mad speed. Then, at the summit of the pass, the sedan swerved abruptly to the right and fled west along the Mulholland Highway. Gordon's tires screamed as he swerved the roadster in hot pursuit. The dark, winding mountain highway was nearly deserted at that hour of the night. Save for the occasional automobile that swerved frantically to the side of the road to dodge the roaring onslaught of the racing cars, Gordon and the stranger had the road to themselves. The stranger seemed no longer to be trying to leave his pursuer hopelessly behind. He allowed Gordon to come within 100 yards of him, but that was as near as Gordon could get, in spite of the roadster's best efforts. Half a dozen times, Gordon trod savagely upon his accelerator in a desperate attempt to close the gap, but each time the sedan fled with the swift grace of a scudding phantom. Finally, Gordon had to content himself with merely keeping his distance behind the glowing red taillight of the car ahead. They passed Laurel Canyon, and still the big sedan bored on to the west. Then, finally, half a dozen miles beyond Laurel Canyon, the stranger abruptly left the main highway and started up a narrow private road to the crest of one of the lonely hills. Gordon slowly gained in the next 2 miles. When the road ended in a winding gravel driveway into the grounds of what was apparently a private estate, the roadster was scarcely a dozen yards behind. The stranger's features, as he stood there stiffly erect in the vivid glare of the roadster's headlights, were still as devoid of all expression as ever. The only things that really seemed alive in that mask of a face were the 2 eyes, glowing eerie blue-green fire like twin entities of alien evil. Gordon wasted no time in verbal sparring. He motioned briefly to Leah Keith's rigid form in the front seat of the sedan. "Miss Keith is returning to Hollywood with me," he said curtly. "Will you let her go peaceably, or shall I?" He left the question unfinished, but its threat was obvious. "Or shall you do what?" asked the stranger quietly. There was an oddly metallic ring in his low, even tones. His words were so precisely clipped that they suggested some origin more mechanical than human. "Or shall I take Miss Keith with me by force?" Gordon flared angrily. "You can try to take the lady by force, if you wish." There was an unmistakable jeering note in the metallic tones. The taunt was the last thing needed to unleash Gordon's volatile temper. He stepped forward and swung a hard left hook for that expressionless mask of a face. But the blow never landed. The stranger dodged with uncanny swiftness. His answering gesture seemed merely the gentlest possible push with an outstretched hand. Yet Gordon was sent reeling backward a full dozen steps by the terrific force of the apparently gentle blow. Recovering himself, Gordon grimly returned to the attack. The stranger again flung out one hand in the contemptuous gesture with which one would brush away a troublesome fly. But this time, Gordon was more cautious. He neatly dodged the stranger's blow, then swung a vicious right squarely for his adversary's unprotected jaw. The blow smashed solidly home with all of Gordon's weight behind it. The stranger's jaw buckled and gave beneath that shattering impact. Then, abruptly, his entire face crumpled into distorted ruin. Gordon staggered back a step in sheer horror at the gruesome result of his blow. The stranger flung a hand up to his shattered features. When his hand came away again, his whole face came away with it. Gordon had one horror-stricken glimpse of a featureless blob of rubbery, bluish-gray flesh, in which fiendish eyes of blue-green fire blazed in malignant fury. Then the stranger fumbled at his collar, ripped the linen swiftly away. Something lashed out from beneath his throat, a loathsome, snake-like object, slender and forked at the end. For one ghastly moment, as the writhing tentacle swung into line with him, Gordon saw its forked ends glow strange fire, one a vivid blue, the other a sparkling green. Then the world was abruptly blotted out for Blair Gordon. Consciousness returned to Gordon as swiftly and painlessly as it had left him. For a moment He blinked stupidly in a dazed effort to comprehend the incredible scene before him. He was seated in a chair over near the wall of a large room that was flooded with livid red light from a single globe overhead. Beside him sat Leah Keith, also staring with dazed eyes in an effort to comprehend her surroundings. Directly in front of them stood a figure of stark nightmare horror. The weirdly glowing eyes identified the figure as that of the stranger at the Maori hut, but there every point of resemblance ceased. Only the cleverest of facial masks and body padding could ever have enabled this monstrosity to pass unnoticed in a world of normal human beings. Now that his disguise was completely stripped away, his slight frame was revealed as a grotesque parody of that of a human being, with arms and legs like pipe stems, a bald oval head that merged with necklace rigidity directly into a heavy-shouldered body that tapered into an almost wasp-like slenderness at the waist. He was naked, save for a loincloth of some metallic fabric. His bluish-gray skin had a dull, oily sheen strangely suggestive of fine-grained flexible metal. The creature's face was hideously unlike anything human. Beneath the glowing eyes was a small circular mouth orifice with a cluster of gill-like appendages on either side of it. Patches of lighter-colored skin on either side of the head seemed to serve as ears. From a point just under the head, where the throat of a human being would have been, dangled a 1.5-foot-long tentacle whose forked tip had sent Gordon into oblivion. Behind the creature, Gordon was dimly aware of a maze of complicated and utterly unfamiliar apparatus ranged along the opposite wall, giving the room the appearance of being a laboratory of some kind. Gordon's obvious bewilderment seemed to amuse the bluish-gray monstrosity. "May I introduce myself?" he asked with a mocking note in his metallic voice. "I am Arlok of Zoran. I am an explorer of space, and more particularly an opener of gates. My home is upon Zoran, which is one of the 11 major planets that circle about the giant blue-white sun that your astronomers call Rigel. I am here to open the gate between your world and mine." Gordon reached a reassuring hand over to Leah. All memory of their quarrel was obliterated in the face of their present peril. He felt her slender fingers twine firmly with his. The warm contact gave them both new courage. "We of Zoran need your planet and intend to take possession of it," Arlok continued. "But the vast distance which separates Rigel from your solar system makes it impracticable to transport any considerable number of our people here in space cars, for though our space cars travel with practically the speed of light, it requires over 540 years for them to cross that great void. So I was sent as a lone pioneer to your Earth to do the work necessary here in order to open the gate that will enable Zoran to cross the barrier in less than a minute of your time. That gate is the one through the 4th dimension, for Zoran and your planet in a 4-dimensional universe are almost touching each other in spite of the great distance separating them in a 3-dimensional universe. We of Zoran, being 3-dimensional creatures like you Earthlings, cannot even exist on a 4-dimensional plane. But we can, by the use of apparatus to open a gate, pass through a thin sector of the 4th dimension and emerge in a far distant part of our 3-dimensional universe. The situation of our two worlds," Arlok continued, "is somewhat like that of two dots on opposite ends of a long strip of paper that is curved almost into a circle. To 2-dimensional beings, capable only of realizing and traveling along the 2 dimensions of the paper itself, those dots might be many feet apart. Yet in the 3rd dimension, straight across free space, they might be separated by only the 1,000th part of an inch. In order to take that shortcut across the 3rd dimension, the 2-dimensional creatures of the paper would have only to transform a small strip of the intervening space into a 2-dimensional surface like their paper. They could do this, of course, by the use of proper vibration-creating machinery, for all things in a material universe are merely a matter of vibration. We of Zoran plan to cross the barrier of the fourth dimension by creating a narrow strip of vibrations powerful enough to exactly match and nullify those of the fourth dimension itself. The result will be that this narrow strip will temporarily become an area of 3 dimensions only, an area over which we can safely pass from our world to yours." Arlok indicated one of the pieces of apparatus along the opposite wall of the room. It was an intricate arrangement of finely wound coils with wires leading to scores of needle-like points, which constantly shimmered and crackled with tiny blue-white flames. Thick cables ran to a bank of concave reflectors of some gleaming grayish metal. "There is the apparatus which will supply the enormous power necessary to nullify the vibrations of the fourth-dimensional barrier," Arlok explained. "It is a condenser and adapter of the cosmic force that you call the Millikan rays. In Zoran, a similar apparatus is already set up and finished, but the gate can only be opened by simultaneous actions from both sides of the barrier. That is why I was sent on my long journey through space to do the necessary work here. I am now nearly finished. A very few hours more will see the final opening of the gate. Then the fighting hordes of Zoran can sweep through the barrier and overwhelm your planet. When the gate from Zoran to a new planet is first opened," Arlok continued, "our scientists always like to have at least one pair of specimens of the new world's inhabitants sent through to them for experimental use. So tonight, while waiting for one of my final castings to cool, I improved the time by making a brief raid upon the place that you call the Maori Hut. The lady here seemed an excellent type of your Earthling women, and the meteoric iron in her necklace made a perfect focus for electric hypnosis. Her escort was too inferior a specimen to be of value to me, so I killed him when he attempted to interfere. When you gave chase, I lured you on until I could see whether you might be usable. You proved an excellent specimen, so I merely stunned you. Very soon now, I shall be ready to send the 2 of you through the gate to our scientists in Zoran." A cold wave of sheer horror swept over Gordon. It was impossible to doubt the stark and deadly menace promised in the plan of this grim visitor from an alien universe, a menace that loomed not only for Gordon and Leah, but for the teeming millions of a doomed and defenseless world. "Let me show you Zoran," Arlok offered. "Then you may be better able to understand." He turned his back carelessly upon the 2 captives and strode over to the apparatus along the opposite wall. Gordon longed to hurl himself upon the unprotected back of the retreating Zoranian, but he knew that any attempt of that kind would be suicidal. Arlok's deadly tentacle would strike him down before he was halfway across the room. He searched his surroundings with desperate eyes for anything that might serve as a weapon. Then his pulse quickened with sudden hope. There on a small table near Leah was the familiar bulk of a .45 caliber revolver, loaded and ready for use. It was included in a miscellaneous collection of other small earthly tools and objects that Arlok had apparently collected for study. There was an excellent chance that Leah might be able to secure the gun unobserved. Gordon pressed her fingers in a swift attempt at signaling, then jerked his head ever so slightly toward the table. A moment later, the quick answering pressure of Leah's fingers told him that she had understood his message. From the corner of his eye, Gordon saw Leah's other hand begin cautiously groping behind her for the revolver. Then both Gordon and Leah froze into sudden immobility, as Arlok faced them again from beside an apparatus slightly reminiscent of an earthly radio set. Arlok threw a switch, and a small bank of tubes glowed pale green. A yard-square plate of bluish-gray metal on the wall above the apparatus glowed with milky fluorescence. "It is easy to penetrate the barrier with light waves," Arlok explained. "That is a gate that can readily be opened from either side. It was through it that we first discovered your Earth." Arlok threw a rheostat on to more power. The luminous plate cleared swiftly. "And there, Earthlings, is Zoran," Arlok said proudly. Leah and Gordon gasped in sheer amaze as the glowing plate became a veritable window into another world, a world of utter and alien terror. The livid light of a giant red sun blazed mercilessly down upon a landscape from which every vestige of animal and plant life had apparently been stripped. Naked rocks and barren soil stretched illimitably to the far horizon in a vast monotony of utter desolation. Arlok twirled the knob of the apparatus, and another scene flashed into view. In this scene, great gleaming squares and cones of metal rose in towering clusters from the starkly barren land. Hordes of creatures like Arlok swarmed in and around the metal buildings. Giant machines whirled countless wheels in strange tasks. From 1,000 great needle-like projections on the buildings spurted shimmering sheets of crackling flame, bathing the entire scene in a whirling mist of fiery vapors. Gordon realized dimly that he must be looking into one of the cities of Zoran, but every detail of the chaotic whirl of activity was too utterly unfamiliar to carry any real significance to his bewildered brain. He was as hopelessly overwhelmed as an African savage would be if transported suddenly into the heart of Times Square. Arlok again twirled the knob. The scene shifted, apparently, to another planet. This world was still alive, with rich verdure and swarming millions of people strangely like those of Earth. But it was a doomed world. The dread gate to Zoran had already been opened here. Legions of bluish-gray Zoranians were attacking the planet's inhabitants, and the attack of those metallic hosts was irresistible. The slight bodies of the Zoranians seemed as impervious to bullets and missiles as though armor-plated. The frantic defense of the beleaguered people of the doomed planet caused hardly a casualty in the Zoranian ranks. The attack of the Zoranians was hideously effective. Clouds of dense yellow fog belched from countless projectors in the hands of the bluish-gray hosts, and beneath that deadly miasma, all animal and plant life on the doomed planet was crumbling, dying, and rotting into a liquid slime. Then even the slime was swiftly obliterated, and the Zoranians were left triumphant upon a world starkly desolate. That was one of the minor planets in the swarm that make up the solar system of the sun that your astronomers call Canopus, Arlok explained. Our first task in conquering a world is to rid it of the unclean surface scum of animal and plant life. When this noxious surface mold is eliminated, the planet is then ready to furnish us sustenance, for we Zoranians live directly upon the metallic elements of the planet itself. Our bodies are of a substance of which your scientists have never even dreamed: deathless, invincible, living metal. Arlok again twirled the control of the apparatus, and the scene was shifted back to the planet of Zoran, this time to the interior of what was apparently a vast laboratory. Here, scores of Zoranian scientists were working upon captives who were pathetically like human beings of Earth itself, working with lethal gases and deadly liquids as human scientists might experiment upon noxious pests. The details of the scene were so utterly revolting, the tortures that were being inflicted so starkly horrible, that Leah and Gordon sat back in their chairs, sick and shaken. Arlok snapped off a switch, and the green light in the tubes died. "That last scene was the laboratory to which I shall send you two presently," he said callously, as he started back across the room toward them. Gordon lurched to his feet, his brain a seething whirl of hate in which all thought of caution was gone, as he tensed his muscles to hurl himself upon that grim monstrosity from the bleak and desolate realm of Zoran. Then he felt Leah tugging surreptitiously at his right hand. The next moment, the bulk of something cold and hard met his fingers. It was the revolver. Leah had secured it while Arlok was busy with his interdimensional televisor. Arlok was rapidly approaching them. Gordon hoped against hope that the menace of that deadly tentacle might be diverted for the fraction of a second necessary for him to get in a crippling shot. Leah seemed to divine his thought. She suddenly screamed hysterically and flung herself on the floor, almost at Arlok's feet. Arlok stopped in obvious wonder and bent over Leah. Gordon took instant advantage of the Xoranian's diverted attention. He whipped the revolver from behind him and fired point blank at Arlok's unprotected head. The bullet struck squarely, but Arlok was not even staggered. A tiny spot of bluish-gray skin upon his oval skull gleamed faintly for a moment under the bullet's impact. Then the heavy pellet of lead, as thoroughly flattened as though it had struck the triple armor of a battleship, dropped spent and harmless to the floor. Arlok straightened swiftly. For the moment he seemed to have no thought of retaliating with his deadly tentacle. He merely stood there, quite still, with one thin arm thrown up to guard his glowing eyes. Gordon sent the remainder of the revolver's bullets crashing home as fast as his finger could press the trigger. At that murderously short range, the smashing rain of lead should have dropped a charging gorilla. But for all the effect Gordon's shot had upon the Xoranian, his ammunition might as well have been pellets of paper. Arlok's glossy hide merely glowed momentarily in tiny patches as the bullet struck and flattened harmlessly, and that was all. His last cartridge fired, Gordon flung the empty weapon squarely at the blue monstrosity's hideous face. Arlok made no attempt to dodge. The heavy revolver struck him high on the forehead, then rebounded harmlessly to the floor. Arlok paid no more attention to the blow than a man would to the casual touch of a wind-blown feather. Gordon desperately flung himself forward upon the Xoranian in one last mad effort to overwhelm him. Arlok dodged Gordon's wild blows, then gently swept the Earthman into the embrace of his thin arms. For one helpless moment, Gordon sensed the incredible strength and adamantine hardness of the Xoranian's slender figure, together with an overwhelming impression of colossal weight in that deceptively slight body. Then Arlok contemptuously flung Gordon away from him. As Gordon staggered backward, Arlok's tentacle lashed upward and leveled upon him. Its twin tips again glowed brilliant green and livid blue. Instantly, every muscle in Gordon's body was paralyzed. He stood there, as rigid as a statue, his body completely deadened from the neck down. Beside him stood Leah, also frozen motionless in that same weird power. "Earthling, you are beginning to try my patience," Arlok snapped. "Can you not realize that I am utterly invincible in any combat with you? The living metal of my body weighs over 1,600 pounds, as you measure weight. The strength inherent in that metal is sufficient to tear 100 of your Earthmen to shreds. But I do not even have to touch you to vanquish you. The electric content of my bodily structure is so infinitely superior to yours that with this tentacle organ of mine I can instantly short-circuit the feeble currents of your nerve impulses and bring either paralysis or death as I choose. But enough of this," Arlok broke off abruptly. "My materials are now ready, and it is time that I finish my work. I shall put you out of my way for a few hours until I am ready to send you through the gate to the laboratories of Xoran." The green and blue fire of the tentacle's tips flamed to dazzling brightness. The paralysis of Gordon's body swept swiftly over his brain. Black oblivion engulfed him. When Gordon again recovered consciousness, he found that he was lying on the floor of what was apparently a narrow hall, near the foot of a stairway. His hands were lashed tightly behind him, and his feet and legs were so firmly pinioned together that he could scarcely move. Beside him lay Leah, also tightly bound. A short distance down the hall was the closed door of Arlok's workroom, recognized by the thin line of red light gleaming beneath it. Moonlight through a window at the rear of the hall made objects around Gordon fairly clear. He looked at Leah and saw tears glistening on her long lashes. "Oh, Blair, I was afraid you'd never waken again," the girl sobbed. "I thought that fiend had killed you." Her voice broke hysterically. "Steady, darling," Gordon said soothingly. "We simply can't give up now, you know. If that monstrosity ever opens that accursed gate of his, our entire world is doomed. There must be some way to stop him. We've got to find that way, and try it, even if it seems only one forlorn chance in a million." Gordon shook his head to clear the numbness still lingering from the effect of Arlok's tentacle. The Xoranian seemed unable to produce a paralysis of any great duration with his weird natural weapon. Accordingly, he had been forced to bind his captives like two trussed fowls while he returned to his labors. Lying close together as they were, it was a comparatively easy matter for them to get their bound hands within reach of each other, but after 15 minutes of vain work, Gordon realized that any attempt at untying the ropes was useless. Arlok's prodigious strength had drawn the knots so tight that no human power could ever loosen them. Then, Gordon suddenly thought of the one thing in his pockets that might help them. It was a tiny cigarette lighter, of the spring-trigger type. It was in his vest pocket, completely out of reach of his bound hands, but there was a way out of that difficulty. Gordon and Leah twisted and rolled their bodies like two contortionists, until they succeeded in getting into such a position that Leah was able to get her teeth in the cloth of the vest pocket's edge. A moment of desperate tugging, then the fabric gave away. The lighter dropped from the torn pocket to the floor, where Leah retrieved it. Then they twisted their bodies back to back. Leah managed to get the lighter flaming in her bound hands. Gordon groped in an effort to guide the ropes on his wrists over the tiny, flickering flame. Then there came the faint, welcome odor of smoldering rope, as the lighter's tiny flame bit into the bonds. Gordon bit his lips to suppress a cry of pain as the flame seared into his skin as well. The flame bit deeper into the rope. A single strand snapped. Then another strand gave way. To Gordon, the process seemed endless, as the flame scorched rope and flesh alike. A long minute of lancing agony that seemed hours. Then Gordon could stand no more. He tensed his muscles in one mighty, agonized effort to end the torture of the flame. The weakened rope gave way completely beneath that pain-maddened lunge. Gordon's hands were free. It was an easy matter now to use the lighter to finish freeing himself and Leah. They made their way swiftly back to the window at the rear of the hall. It slid silently upward. A moment later, they were out in the brilliant moonlight, free. They made their way around to the front of the house. Behind the drawn shades of one of the front rooms, an eerie glow of red light marked the location of Arlok's workroom. They heard the occasional clink of tools inside the room as the Xoranian diligently worked to complete his apparatus. They crept stealthily up to where one of the French windows of Arlok's workroom swung slightly ajar. Through the narrow crevice, they could see Arlok's grotesque back as he labored over the complex assembly of apparatus against the wall. A heavy stone flung through the window would probably wreck that delicate mechanism completely. Yet the two watchers knew that such a respite would be only a temporary one. As long as Arlok remained alive on this planet to build other gates to Xoran, Earth's eventual doom was certain. Complete destruction of Arlok himself was Earth's only hope of salvation. The Xoranian seemed to be nearing the end of his labors. He left the apparatus momentarily and walked over to a workbench where he picked up a slender, rod-like tool. Donning a heavy glove to shield his left hand, he selected a small plate of bluish-gray metal, then pressed a switch in the handle of the tool in his right hand. A blade of blinding white flame, seemingly as solid as a blade of metal, spurted for the length of a foot from the tool's tip. Arlok began cutting the plate with the flame, the blade shearing through the heavy metal as easily as a hot knife shears through butter. The sight brought a sudden surge of exultant hope to Gordon. He swiftly drew Leah away from the window, far enough to the side that their low-voiced conversation could not be heard from inside the workroom.
"Leah, there is our one chance," he explained excitedly. "That blue fiend is vulnerable, and that flame tool of his is the weapon to reach his vulnerability. Did you notice how careful he was to shield his other hand with a glove before he turned the tool on? He can be hurt by that blade of flame, and probably hurt badly."
Leah nodded in quick understanding.
"If I could lure him out of the room for just a moment, you could slip in through the window and get that flame tool, Blair," she suggested eagerly.
"That might work," Gordon agreed reluctantly. "But Leah, don't run any more risks than you absolutely have to." He picked up a small rock. "Here, take this with you. Open the door into the hall and attract Arlok's attention by throwing the rock at his precious apparatus. Then the minute he sees you, try to escape out through the hall again. He'll leave his work to follow you. When he returns to his workroom, I'll be waiting for him. And I'll be waiting with a weapon that can stab through even that armor-plated hide of his." They separated, Lee to enter the house, Gordon to return to the window. Arlok was back over in front of the apparatus, fitting into place the piece of metal he had just cut. The flame tool, its switch now turned off, was still on the workbench. Gordon's heart pounded with excitement as he crouched there with his eyes fixed upon the closed hall door. The minutes seemed to drag interminably. Then, suddenly, Gordon's muscles tensed. The knob of the hall door had turned ever so slightly. Leah was at her post. The next moment, the door was flung open with a violence that sent it slamming back against the wall. The slender figure of Leah stood framed in the opening, her dark eyes blazing as she flung one hand up to hurl her missile. Arlok whirled just as Leah threw the rock straight at the intricate gate-opening apparatus. With the speed of thought, the Xoranian flung his own body over to shield his fragile instruments. The rock thudded harmlessly against his metallic chest. Then Arlok's tentacle flung out like a striking cobra, its forked tip flaming blue and green fire as it focused upon the open door. But Leah was already gone. Gordon heard her flying footsteps as she raced down the hall. Arlok promptly sped after her in swift pursuit. As Arlok passed through the door into the hall, Gordon flung himself into the room and sped straight for the workbench. He snatched the flame tool up, then darted over to the wall by the door. He was not a second too soon. The heavy tread of Arlok's return was already audible in the hall just outside. Gordon prepared to stake everything upon his one slim chance of disabling that fearful tentacle before Arlok could bring it into action. He pressed the tiny switch in the flame tool's handle just as Arlok came through the door. Arlok, startled by the glare of the flame tool's blazing blade, whirled toward Gordon, but too late. That thin, searing shaft of vivid flame had already struck squarely at the base of the Xoranian's tentacle. A seething spray of hissing sparks marked the place where the flame bit deeply home. Arlok screamed, a ghastly, metallic note of anguish like nothing human. The Xoranian's powerful hands clutched at Gordon, but he leaped lithely backward out of their reach. Then Gordon again attacked, the flame tool's shining blade licking in and out like a rapier. The searing flame swept across one of Arlok's arms, and the Xoranian winced. Then the blade stabbed swiftly at Arlok's waist. Arlok half-doubled as he flinched back. Gordon shifted his aim with lightning speed and sent the blade of flame lashing in one accurate terrible stroke that caught Arlok squarely in the eyes. Again, Arlok screamed in intolerable agony as that tearing flame darkened forever his glowing eyes. In berserker fury, the tortured Xoranian charged blindly toward Gordon. Gordon warily dodged to one side. Arlok, sightless, and with his tentacle crippled, still had enough power in that mighty metallic body of his to tear 100 Earthmen to pieces. Gordon stung Arlok's shoulder with the flame, then desperately leaped to one side just in time to dodge a flailing blow that would have made pulp of his body had it landed. Arlok went stark wild in his frenzied efforts to come to grips with his unseen adversary. Furniture crashed and splintered to kindling wood beneath his threshing feet. Even the stout walls of the room shivered and crackled as the incredible weight of Arlok's body caromed against them. Gordon circled lithely around the crippled blue monstrosity like a timber wolf circling a wounded moose. He began concentrating his attack upon Arlok's left leg. Half a dozen deep slashes with the searing flame. Then suddenly the thin leg crumpled and broke. Arlok crashed helplessly to the floor. Gordon was now able to shift his attack to Arlok's head. Dodging the blindly flailing arms of the Zoranian, he stabbed again and again at the oval-shaped skull. The searing thrusts began to have their effect. Arlok's convulsive movements became slower and weaker. Gordon sent the flame stabbing in a long, final thrust in an attempt to pierce through to that alien metal brain. With startling suddenness, the flame burned its way home to some unknown center of life force in the oval skull. There was a brief but appalling gush of bright purple flame from Arlok's eye sockets and mouth orifice. Then his twitching body stiffened. His bluish-gray hide darkened with incredible swiftness into a dull black. Arlok was dead. Gordon, sickened at the grisly ending to the battle, snapped off the flame tool and turned to search for Leah. He found her already standing in the hall door, alive and unhurt.
"I escaped through the window at the end of the hall," she explained. "Arlok quit following me as soon as he saw that you too were gone from where he had left us tied."
She shuddered as she looked down at the Zoranian's mangled body.
"I saw most of your fight with him, Blair. It was terrible, awful. But Blair, we've won."
"Yes, and now we'll make sure of the fruits of our victory," Gordon said grimly, starting over toward the gate-opening apparatus with the flame tool in his hand. A very few minutes' work with the shearing blade of flame reduced the intricate apparatus to a mere tangled pile of twisted metal. Arlok, gate-opener of Zoran, was dead, and the gate to that grim planet was now irrevocably closed.
"Blair, do you feel it too, that eerie feeling of countless eyes still watching us from Zoran?"
There was frank awe in Leah's half-whispered question.
"You know how Arlok said that they had watched us for centuries from their side of the barrier? I'm sure they're watching us now. Will they send another opener of gates to take up the work where Arlok failed?"
Gordon took Leah into his arms. "I don't know, dear," he admitted gravely. "They may send another messenger, but I doubt it. This world of ours has had its warning, and it will heed it. The Watchers on Zoran must know that in the 540 years it would take their next messenger to get here, the Earth will have had more than enough time to prepare an adequate defense." It was as if someone had thrown a bomb into a Quaker meeting, when adventure suddenly began to crowd itself into the life of the studious and methodical Leslie Larner, professor of entomology. Fame had been his since early manhood, when he began to distinguish himself in several sciences. But the adventure and thrills he had longed for had always fallen to the lot of others. His father, a college professor, had left him a good working brain and nothing else. Later his mother died, and he was left with no relatives in the world, so far as he knew. So he gave his life over to study and hard work. Still youthful at 25, he was hoping that fate would give him a break. It did. He was in charge of a government department having to do with oriental beetles, Hessian flies, boll weevils and such, and it seemed his life had just been one bug after another. He took creeping, crawling things seriously, and believed that, unless curbed, insects would someday crowd man off the earth. He sounded an alarm, but humanity was not disturbed. So Leslie Larner fell back on his microscope and concerned himself with saving cotton, wheat, and other crops. His only diversion was fishing for the elusive rainbow trout. He managed to spend a month each year in the Colorado Rockies angling for speckled beauties. Larner was anything but a clock watcher, but on a certain bright day in June he was seated in his laboratory doing just that. Just 5 minutes to go, he mused. It was just 4:25 p.m. He had finished his work, put his affairs in order, and in 5 minutes would be free to leave on a much-needed and well-earned vacation. His bags were packed and at the station. His fishing tackle, the pride of his young life, was neatly rolled in oiled silk and stood near at hand. "I'll just fill my calabash, take one more quiet smoke, and then for the mountains and freedom," he told himself. He settled back with his feet on his desk. He half closed his eyes in solid comfort. Then the bomb fell and exploded. Brrr! The buzzer on his desk buzzed, and his feet came off the desk and hit the floor with a thud. His eyes popped open, and the calabash was immediately laid aside. That buzzer usually meant business, and it would be his usual luck to have trouble cash in on him just as he was on the edge of a rainbow trout paradise. A messenger was ushered into the room by an assistant. The boy handed him an envelope, said, "No answer," and departed. Larner tore open the envelope lazily. He read and then reread its contents, while a look of puzzled surprise disturbed his usually placid countenance. He spread the sheet of paper out on his desk, and for the 10th time he read, "Confidential. Memorize this address and destroy this paper. Tula Bela, 1726 88th Street, West, City of Hesper, Republic of Pana, Planet Venus. Will meet you in the frying pan." That was all. It was enough. Larner lost his temper. He crumpled the paper and tossed it in the wastebasket. He was not given to profanity, but he could say Judas Priest in a way that sizzled. "Judas Priest!" he spluttered. "Anyone who would send a man a crazy bunch of nonsense like that, at a time like this, ought to be snuffed out like a beetle." He fished the paper out of the wastebasket, found the envelope, placed the strange message within, and put it inside his coat pocket. Then he seized his suitcase and fishing tackle and, rushing out, hailed a taxi. Not long after, he was on his way west by plane. As the country unrolled under him, he retrieved the strange note from his pocket. He read it again and again. Then he examined the envelope. It was an ordinary one of good quality, designed for business rather than social usage. The notepaper appeared quite different. It was unruled, pure white, and of a texture which might be described as pebbly. It was strongly made, and of a nature unlike any paper Larner had ever seen before. It appeared to have been made from a fiber rather than a pulp. "Wonder who wrote it?" Larner asked himself. "It is beautiful handwriting, masculine yet artistic. Wonder where he got the frying pan idea. At any rate, I'm not going to the frying pan this year. I'm camping on Tennessee Creek in Lake County, Colorado. The country there is more beautiful and restful. But this street address on the planet Venus. Seems to me I read somewhere that Marconi had received mysterious signals that he believed came from the planet Venus. Hesper. Hesper. It sounds familiar somehow. Wonder if there could be anything to it." Something impelled him to follow out the instructions in the note. He spent the next few hours repeating the address over and over again. When he was satisfied that he had memorized it thoroughly, he tore the strange paper into bits and sent it fluttering earthward like a tiny snowstorm. Larner was not a gullible individual, but neither was he unimaginative. He was scientist enough to know that the impossibilities of today are the accomplishments of tomorrow. So while not convinced that the note was a serious communication, still his mind was open. The weird address insisted on creeping into his mind and driving out other thoughts, even those of his speckled playfellows, the rainbow trout. "I've a notion to change my plans and go from Denver to the frying pan," he cogitated. Then he thought, "No, I won't take it that seriously." Anyone who knows the Colorado Rockies knows paradise. There is no more beautiful country on the globe. Lake County, where Larner had chosen his fishing grounds, has as its seat the old mining camp of Leadville. It has been visited and settled more for its gold mines than the golden glow of its sunsets above the clouds. But the gold of the sunsets is eternal, while the gold of the miners is fading quickly away. Leadville, with its 5,000 inhabitants, nestles above the clouds, at an altitude of more than 10,000 feet. Mount Massive, with its 3 peaks, lies back of the town in panorama and rises to a height of some 14,400 feet. In the rugged mountains thereabouts are hundreds of lakes fed by wild streams and bubbling crystal springs. All these lakes are above the clouds. Winter sees the whole picture decorated with bizarre snowdrifts from 20 to 40 feet deep, but spring comes early. The beautiful columbines and crocuses bloom before the snow is all off the ground in the valleys. The lands up to 12,000 feet altitude are carpeted with a light green grass and moss. Giant pines and dainty aspens, with their silvery bark and pinkish leaves, blossom forth and whisper, while the eternal snow still linger in the higher rocky cliffs and peaks above. Indian paint blooms its blood red in contrast to the milder colorings. Blackbirds and bluebirds chatter and chipmunks chirp. The gold, so hard to find in the mines, glares from the skies. The hills cuddle in banks of snowy clouds, and above all, a pure, clear blue sky sweeps. The lakes and streams abound with rainbow trout, the gamest of any freshwater fish. It is indeed a paradise for either poet or sportsman. In any direction near to Leadville, a man can find heaven and recreation and rest. Finding himself on Harrison Avenue, the main street of the county seat, Larner, after renewing some old acquaintanceships, started west in a flivver for Tennessee Creek. The flivver is a modern adjustment. Until a few years ago, the only means of traversing these same hills was by patient, sure-footed donkeys, which carried the pack while the wayfarer walked along beside. The first day's fishing was good. Trout seemed to greet him cheerily and sprang eagerly to the fray. They bit at any sort of silken fly he cast. The site chosen by Larner for his camp was in a mossy clearing separated from the stream by a fringe of willows along the creek. Then came a border of aspens backed by a forest of silver-tipped firs. It was ideal, and his eyes swept the scene with satisfaction. Then he began whittling bacon to grease his pan for frying trout over the open fire. Suddenly he heard a rustle in the aspens, and looking up, beheld a picture which made his eyes bulge. A man and a woman, garbed seemingly in the costumes of another world, walked toward him. Neither were more than 5 feet tall, but were physically perfect, and marvelously pleasing to the eye. There was little difference in their dress. Both wore helmets studded with what Larner believed to be sapphires. He learned later they were diamonds. Their clothing consisted of tight, trouser-like garments surmounted by tunics of some white pelt resembling chamois, save for color. A belt studded with precious stones encircled their waists. Artistic laced sandals graced their small, firm feet. Their skin was a pinkish white. Their every feature was perfection plus, and their bodies curved just enough wherever a curve should be. The woman was daintier and more fully developed, and her features were even more finely chiseled than the man. Otherwise, it would have been difficult to distinguish their sex. Larner took in these details subconsciously, for he was awed beyond expression. All he could do was to stand seemingly frozen, half bent over the campfire with his frying pan in his hand. The man spoke. "I hope we did not startle you," he said. "I thought my note would partly prepare you for this meeting. We expected to find you in the Frying Pan district. When you did not appear there, we tuned our radio locator to your heartbeats, and in that way located you here. It was hardly a second's space flying time from where we were." Larner said nothing. He could only stand and gape. "I do not wonder that you are surprised," said the strange little man. "I will explain that I am Nirn Bela, of the city of Hesper, on the planet Venus. This is my sister Tula. We greet you in the interest of the Republic of Pana, which embraces all of the planet you know as Venus." When Larner recovered his breath, he lost his temper. "I don't know what circus you escaped from, but I crave solitude, and I have no time to be bothered with fairy tales," he said with brutal brusqueness. Expressions of hurt surprise swept the countenances of his visitors. The man spoke again. "We are just what we assert we are, and our finding you was made necessary by a condition which grieves the souls of all the 900 million inhabitants of Venus. We have come to plead with you to come with us and use your scientific knowledge to thwart a scourge which threatens the lives of millions of people." There was a quiet dignity about the man and an air of pride about the woman which made Larner stop and think, or try to. He rubbed his hand over his brow and looked questioningly at the pair. "If you are what you say you are, how did you get here?" he asked. "We came in a Targo, a space flying ship capable of doing 426,000 miles an hour. This is just 1,200 times as fast as 355 miles an hour, the highest speed known on Earth. Come with us, and we will show you our ship." They looked at him appealingly, and both smiled a smile of wistful friendliness. Larner, without a word, threw down his frying pan and followed them through the aspens. The brother and sister walking ahead of him gave his eyes a treat. He surveyed the perfect form of the girl. Her perfection was beyond his ken. "They certainly are not of this world," he mused. A few hundred yards farther on there was a beach of pebbles, where the stream had changed its course. On this plot sat a gigantic spherical machine of a glass-like material. It was about 300 feet in diameter, and it was tapered on two sides into T's, which Larner rightly took to be lights. "This is a Targo, our type of space flyer," said Nirn Bela. "It is capable of making 2 trips a year between Venus and the Earth. We have visited this planet often, always landing in some mountain or jungle fastness, as heretofore we did not desire Earth-dwellers to know of our presence." "Why not?" asked Larner, his mouth agape and his eyes protruding. His mind was so full of questions that he fairly blurted his first one. "Because," said Bela, slowly and frankly, "because our race knows no sickness, and we feared contagion, as your race has not yet learned to control its being." "Oh," said Larner thoughtfully. He realized that humans of Earth, whom he had always regarded as God's most perfect beings, were not so perfect after all. "How do you people control your being, as you express it?" he asked. "It is simple," was the reply. "For 90 centuries we have ceased to breed in perfection, crime, and disease. We deprived no one of the pleasures of life, but only the most perfect mental and physical specimens of our people care to have children. In other words, while we make no claim to controlling our sex habits, we do control results." "Oh," said Larner again. Nirn Bela led the way to a door which opened into the side of the space flyer near its base. "We have a crew of 4 men and 4 women," he said. "They handle the entire ship, with my sister and I in command, making 6 souls aboard in all." "Why men and women?" thought Larner. As if in answer to his thought, Bela said, "On the Earth, the 2 sexes have struggled for sex supremacy. This has thrown your civilization out of balance. On Venus, we have struggled for sex equality and have accomplished it. This is a perfect balance. Men and women engage in all endeavor and share all favors and rewards alike." "In war, too?" asked Larner. "There has not been war on Venus for 600,000 years," said Bela. "There is only one nation, and the people all live in perfect accord. Our only trouble in centuries is a dire peril which now threatens our people. And it is of this that I wish to talk to you more at length." They were standing close to the targo. Larner was struck by the peculiar material of which it was constructed. There was a question in his eyes, and Nern Bela answered it. "The metal is duranium. It is metallized quartz. It is frictionless, conducts no current or ray except repulsion and attraction ray NTR 69X6, by which it is propelled. It is practically transparent, lighter than air, and harder than a diamond. It is cast in molds after being melted, or rather fused. We use cold light, which we produce by forcing oxygen through air tubes into a vat filled with the fat of a deep-sea fish resembling your whale. You are aware, of course, that is exactly how cold light is produced by the firefly, except for the fact that the firefly uses its own fat." Larner was positively fascinated. He smoothed the metal of the targo in appreciation of its marvelous construction, but he longed most to see the curious light-giving mechanism, for this was closer to his own line of entomology. He had always believed that the light-giving organisms of fireflies and deep-sea fishes could be reproduced mechanically. The interior of the ship resembled in a vague way that of an ocean liner. It was controlled by an instrument board at which a man and a girl sat. They did not raise their heads as the 3 people entered. When called by Bela and his sister, who seemed to give commands in unison, the crew assembled and were presented to the visitor. "Earth dwellers are not the curiosity to us that they seem to be to you," said Tula Bela, speaking for the first time and smiling sweetly. Larner was too engrossed to note the remark further than to nod his head. He was lost in contemplation of these strange people, all garbed exactly alike and all surpassingly lovely to look upon. An odor of food wafted from the galley, and Larner remembered he was hungry, with the hunger of health. He had swung his basket of fish over his shoulder when he left the campfire, and Tula took it from him. "Would you like to have the chef prepare them for you?" she said, as she caught his hungry glance at his day's catch. This time Larner answered her. "If you will pardon me," he said awkwardly, "really, I am famished." "You will not miss your fish dinner," said the girl. "I believe there is enough for all of us," said Larner. "I caught 20 beauties. I never knew fish to bite like that. Why they—" And he was off on a voluminous discourse on a favorite subject. Those assembled listened sympathetically. Then Tula took the fish, and soon the aroma of broiling trout mingled with the other entrancing galley odors. After dinner, at which some weird yet satisfying viands were served and much unusual conversation indulged in, Nern Bela led the way to what appeared to be the captain's quarters. The crew and their visitor sat down to discuss a subject which proved to be of such a terrifying nature as to scar human souls. "People on Venus," said Nern, and his eyes took on a worried expression, "are unable to leave their homes after nightfall, due to some strange nocturnal beast which attacks them and vampirishly drains all blood from their veins, leaving the dead bodies limp and empty." "What? How?" questioned Larner, leaning far forward over the conference table. The others nodded their heads, and in the eyes of the women there was terror. Larner could not but believe this. The beasts, or should I say insects, are as large as your horses, and they fly, actually fly by night, striking down humans, domestic animals, and all creatures of warm blood. How many there are we have no means of knowing, and we cannot find their hiding and breeding places. They are not native to our planet, and where they come from we cannot imagine. They are actually monstrous flies, or bugs, or some form of insects. Larner was overcome by incredulity and showed it. Insects as big as horses? He questioned, and he could hardly suppress a smile. Believe us, in the name of the God of us all, insisted Nern. They have a mouth which consists of a large suction disk, in the center of which is a lance-like tongue. The lance is forced into the body at any convenient point, and the suction disk drains out the blood. If we only knew their source. They attack young children and the aged, up to 500 years alike. What? 500 years? Exploded Larner again. I should have explained, said Nern simply, that Venus dwellers, due to our advanced knowledge of sanitation and health conversation, live about 800 years and then die invariably of old age. The only unnatural cause of death encountered is this giant insect. Accidents do occur, but they are rare. There are no deliberate killings on Venus. Larner did not answer. He only pondered. The more he ran over the strange happenings of the last week in his mind, the more he believed he was dreaming. His thoughts took a strange turn. Why do these vain people go around dressed in jeweled ornaments? Nern again anticipated a question. Diamonds, gold, and many of what you call precious stones are common on Venus, he volunteered. Talc and many other things are more valuable. Talc? Yes, we use an immense quantity of it. We have a wood that is harder than your steel. We build machinery with it. We cannot use oil to lubricate these wooden shafts and bearings, as it softens the wood, so all parts exposed to friction are sprayed constantly by a gust of talc from a blower. You use talc mostly for toilet purposes. We use it for various purposes. There is little left on Venus, and it is more valuable to us than either gold or diamonds. We draw on your planet now for talc. You dump immense quantities. We just shipped 100 1,000-ton globes of it from the Cripple Creek district, and the district never missed it. We drew most of it from your mine dumps. Nern tried not to look bored as he explained more in detail. We brought 100 hollow spheres constructed of duranium. We suspended these over the Cripple Creek district at an altitude of 10,000 feet above the Earth's surface. Because of the crystal glint of duranium, they were invisible to Earth dwellers at that height. Then we use a suction draft at night, drawing the talc from the Earth, filling one drum after another. This is done by tuning in a certain selective attraction that attracts only talc. It draws it right out of your ground in tiny particles, and assembles it in the transportation drums as pure talc. On the Earth, if noticed at all, it would have been called a dust storm. The drums, when loaded with talc, are set to attract the proper planetary force, and they go speeding toward Venus at the rate of 426,000 miles an hour. They are prevented from colliding with meteors by an automatic magnetic device. This is controlled by magnetic force alone, and when the targo gets too close to a meteor, it changes its course instantly. The passenger targo we ride in acts similarly. And now, may I return to the subject of the vampires of Venus? Pardon my ignorance, said Larner, and for the first time in his life he felt very ignorant indeed. I know little more than I have told you, said Nern, rather hopelessly. Our knowledge of your world, your people, and your language comes from listening in on you and observing you without being observed or heard. This might seem like taking an advantage of you, were it not for the fact that we respect confidences and subjugate all else to science. We have helped you at times by telepathically suggesting ideas to your thinkers. We would have given you all our inventions in this way gladly, but in many instances we were unable to find minds attuned to accept such advanced ideas. We have had the advantage of you because our planet is so many millions of years older than your own." There was a plaintive note in Nern's voice as he talked. "But now we are on our knees to you, so to speak. We do not know everything, and desperately we need the aid of a man of your caliber. In behalf of the distraught people of Venus, I am asking you bluntly to make a great sacrifice. Will you face the dangers of a trip to Venus and use your knowledge to aid us in exterminating these creatures of hell?" There was a positive pleading in his voice, and in the eyes of his beautiful sister there were tears. "But what would my superiors in the Government Bureau think?" feebly protested Larner. "I could not explain." "You have no superiors in your line. Our government needs you at this time more than any earthly government. Your place here is a fixture. You can always return to it, should you live. We are asking you to face a horrible death with us. You can name your own compensation, but I know you are not interested so much in reward. Now, honestly, my good professor, there is no advantage to be gained by explanation. Just disappear. In the name of God and in the interests of science and the salvation of a people who are at your mercy, just drop out of sight. Drop out of life on this planet. Come with us. The cause is worthy of the man I believe you to be." "I will go," said Larner, and his hosts waited for no more. An instant later, the Targo shot out into interstellar space. "How do you know what course to follow?" asked Larner after a reasonable time, when he had recovered from his surprise at the sudden take-off. "We do not need to know. Our machine is tuned to be attracted by the planetary force of Venus alone. We could not go elsewhere. A repulsion ray finds us as we near Venus and protects us against too violent a landing. We will land on Venus like a feather about 3 months from tonight." The time of the journey through outer space was of little moment, save for one incident. Larner and the other travelers were suddenly and rather rudely jostled about the rapidly flying craft. Larner lost his breath, but not his speech. "What happened?" he inquired. "We just automatically dodged a meteor," explained Nern. Most of the time of the trip was spent by Larner in listening to explanations of customs and traditions of the people of the brightest planet in the universe. There was a question Larner had desired to ask Nern Bela, yet he hesitated to do so. Finally, one evening during the journey to Venus, when the travelers had been occupying themselves in a scientific discussion of comparative evolution on the 2 planets, Larner saw his opportunity. "Why," he asked rather hesitantly, "did the people of Venus always remain so small? Why did you not strive more for height? The Japanese, who are the shortest in stature of Earth people, always wanted to be tall." "Without meaning any offense," replied Nern, "I must say that it is characteristic of Earth-dwellers to want something without knowing any good reason why they want it. It is perfectly all right for you people to be tall, but for us it is not so fitting. You see, Venus is smaller than the Earth. Size is comparative. You think we are not tall because you are used to taller people. Comparatively, we are tall enough. In proportion to the size of our planet, we are exactly the right size. We keep our population at 900 million, and that is the perfectly exact number of people who can live comfortably on our planet." Arriving on Venus, Larner was assigned a laboratory and office in one of the government buildings. It was a world seemingly made of glass. Quartz, of rose, white, and crystal coloring, Larner found, was the commonest country rock of the planet. In many cases it was shot full of splinters of gold, which the natives had not taken the trouble to recover. This quartz was of a terrific hardness, and was used in building, paving, and public works generally. The effect was bewildering. It was a world of shimmering crystal. The atmosphere of Venus had long puzzled Larner. While not an astronomer in the largest sense of the word, yet he had a keen interest in the heavens as a giant puzzle picture, and he had given some spare time to the study. He knew that from all indications Venus had a most unusual atmosphere. He had read that the atmosphere was considerably denser than that of the Earth, and that its presence made observation difficult. The actual surface of the planet he knew could hardly be seen, due either to this atmosphere or seemingly perpetual cloud banks. He had read that the presence of atmosphere surrounding Venus is indicated to earthly astronomers during the planet's transit by rings of light due to the reflection and scattering of collected sunlight by its atmosphere. Astronomers on Earth, he knew, had long been satisfied of the presence of great cloud banks, as rocks and soils could not have such high reflecting power. He knew that, like the Moon, Venus, when viewed from the Earth, presents different phases from the crescent to the full or total stage. Looking up at the sky from the quartz streets of Venus, Larner beheld, in sweeping grandeur, massed cloud banks, many of them apparently rain clouds. Nern noted his skyward gaze and said, "We have accomplished meteorological control. Those clouds were brought under control when we conquered interplanetary force, what you call gravity. We form them and move them at will. They are our rain factory. We make rain when and where we will. This ensures our crops and makes for health and contentment. The air, you will note, is about the same or a little more moist than the Earth air at sea level. This is due to the planet's position nearer the sun. We have been striving for centuries to make the air a little drier and more rare, but we have not succeeded yet. The heavy content of disintegrated quartz in our soil makes moisture very necessary for our crops, so our moist atmosphere is evidently a provision of Providence. We are used to breathing this moist air, and when I first visited the Earth, I was made uncomfortable by your rarefied atmosphere. Now I can adjust myself to breathing the air of either planet. However, I find myself drinking a great deal more water on Earth than on Venus." In this fairyland, which had enjoyed centuries of peace, health, and accord, stark terror now reigned. In some instances, the finely bred, marvelously intelligent people were in a mental condition bordering on madness. This was especially true in the farming districts, where whole herds of lats had been wiped out. Lats, Larner gleaned, were a common farm animal similar to the bovine species on Earth, only more woolly. On these creatures the Venus dwellers depended for their milk and dairy supplies, and for their warmer clothing, which was made from the skin. The hair was used for brushes, in the building trades, and 1,000 ways in manufacturing. Besides the domestic animals, hundreds of people continued to meet death, and only a few of the flying vampires had been hunted down. The giant insects were believed to breed slowly as compared to Earth insects, their females producing not more than 10 eggs, by estimate, after which death overtook the adult. In spite of this, they were reported to be increasing. In the government building, Larner was placed in touch with all the government scientists of Venus. His nearest collaborator was one Zorn Zada, most profound scientist of the planet. The two men, with a score of assistants, worked elbow to elbow on the most gigantic scientific mystery in the history of 2 planets. A specimen of the dread invader was mounted and studied by the scientists, who were so engrossed in their work that they hardly took time to eat. As for sleep, there was little of it. Days were spent in research and nights in hunting the monsters. This hunting was done by newly recruited soldiers and scientists. The weapons used were a short ray gun of high destructive power, which disintegrated the bodies of the enemies by atomic energy blasts. The quarry was wary, however, and struck at isolated individuals rather than massed fighting lines. Seated at his workbench, Larner asked Zorn Zada what had become of Nirn Bela. In his heart, he had a horrible lurking fear that the beautiful Tula Bela might fall before a swarm of the strange vampires, but he did not voice his anxiety.
"Nirn and his sister are explorers and navigators," was the reply. "They have been assigned to carry you anywhere on this or any other planet where your work may engage you. They await your orders. They are too valuable as space navigators to be placed in harm's way."
Breathing a sigh of relief, Larner bent to his labors. "What other wild animals or harmful insects have you on this planet?" he asked Zorn.
"I get your thought," replied the first scientist of Venus. "You are seeking a natural enemy to this deadly flying menace, are you not?"
"Yes," admitted Larner.
"All insects left Venus with this one exception are beneficial," said Zorn. "There are no wild animals and no harmful insects. All animals, insects, and birds have been domesticated and are fed by their keepers. We get fabrics from forms of what you call spiders and other web builders and cocoon spinners. All forms of birds, beasts, and crawling and flying things have been brought under the dominion of man. We will have to seek another way out than by finding an enemy parasite."
"Where do you think these insect invaders came from?" asked Larner.
"You have noticed they are unlike anything you have on Earth in anatomical construction," said the savant. "They partake of the general features of Coleoptera, beetles, in that they wear a sheath of armor. Yet their mouth parts are more on the order of Diptera, flies. I regard them more as a fly than a beetle, because most Coleoptera are helpful to humanity, while practically all, if not all, Diptera are malignant. As to their original habitat, I believe they migrated here from some other planet."
"They could not fly through space," said Larner.
"No, that is the mystery of it," agreed Zorn. "How they got here and where they breed are the questions that we have to answer."
Long days passed on Venus. Long days and sleepless nights. The big insects were hunted nightly by men armed with ray guns, and nightly the blood-sucking monsters took their toll of humanity and animals. Finally, Larner and Zorn determined to capture one of the insects alive, muzzle its lance and suction pad, and give it sufficient freedom to find its way back to its hiding place. By following the shackled monster, the scientists hoped to find the breeding grounds. All the provinces of the planet joined in the drive. Men turned out in automatic vehicles, propelled by energy gathered from the atmosphere. They came on foot and in aircraft. Mobilization was at given points, and leading the van were Zorn and Larner and their confreres in the targo of Nirn and Tula Bela. The great army of Venus carried giant searchlights and was armed with deadly ray guns. Headquarters of the vast army of offense was in the targo of the Belas. Larner was in supreme command. Just before the big army set out to scour the planet to seek the breeding place of the monsters, Larner issued a bulletin that set all Venus by the ears. "Addressed to President Vol Vesta of the Republic of Pana and the good people of Venus," it read, "As is generally known, it has been the habit of the nation's space-flying merchantmen to visit the sunlit side of the planet Mercury to obtain certain rare woods and other materials not found on this planet. One side of Mercury, as is known, is always turned from the sun, and is in a condition of perpetual night. In this perpetual darkness and dampness, where many rivers flow into warm black swamps, the vampires have bred for centuries. Conditions were ideal for their growth, and so through the ages they evolved into the monsters we have encountered lately on Venus. During some comparatively recent visit to Mercury, the grubs of these insects have found their way aboard a vegetation-laden targo left standing near the edge of the black swamps of Mercury. These grubs were thus transported to Venus and underwent their natural metamorphosis here. Reaching adult stage, they have found some place to hide and breed, and thus is explained the origin of the vampires of Venus. This was widely read and discussed, and was finally accepted as the means of the invasion of peaceful, beautiful Venus by a horror that might well have originated in hell. However, this did not reveal the breeding grounds, or remove the nationwide scourge of the horrible winged vampires, so the mobilization of all forces of the planet continued. As day followed day, the hordes of fighting Venus dwellers grew in the concentration camps. In the Targo of the Belas, Larner, brain-weary and body-racked as he was with overwork, found a grain of happiness in being in the presence of Nirn and his beautiful petite sister. With Zorn, Larner was supervising the construction of a big net of strongly woven wire mesh, in which it was hoped to catch one of the vampires. It was decided to bait the trap with a fat female lat. Zorn, Larner, and the Belas fared forth from the concentration camp, followed by a company of soldiers carrying the big net. Tula, with her own hand, led the fat lat heifer. His eyes were filled with commiseration for the poor animal. Thousands of soldiers and citizenry in fighting array watched the departure of the little group. In a glade, the trap was set, and the net arranged to fall over the monster once it attacked the calf. From a thicket, in utter darkness, Zorn and Larner and the two Belas waited for the possible catch. The whole nation stood awaiting the order to advance. On the fourth night, the vigil was rewarded in a manner frightful to relate. A clumsy flutter of giant wings broke the stillness. The four waiting forms in the thicket rejoiced, believed the fat lat was about to be attacked. Onward came the approaching horror, the measured flap of its armored wings drawing nearer and nearer. Then horror, horrors. A feminine scream rent the air. Cries loud and shrill arose above a hysterical feminine cry for help. The monster had chosen Tula Bela for its prey. Zorn exploded an alarm bomb. A compressed air siren brought the army forward on the run. Giant floodlights began to light up the scene. The blood of Larner and Nirn froze. The monster had borne the girl to the ground. Its frightful lance and cupper was upraised to strike. Larner was the nearest and the quickest to act. He grabbed for his ray gun, swung at his belt. It was gone. In horror, he remembered he had left it at the base. He seized a short knife and threw himself forward, rolling his body between that of the girl and the descending lance and cupper. As the lance pierced his shoulder, Larner, in one wild gesture of frenzy, drove his knife through the soft, yielding flesh of the vampire's organ of suction. Protected by no bony structure, the snout of the monster was amputated. The terrible creature had been disarmed of his most formidable weapon, but he continued to fight. Larner felt the spikes of the monster's legs tear at his flesh. "Don't kill the thing!" he shouted. "Bring on the net! For the love of God, bring on the net!" Then he lost consciousness. It was daylight when Larner, somewhat weakened from loss of blood, regained consciousness. The beautiful Tula Bela was leaning over him. She whispered comforting words to him in a language he did not fully understand. She whispered happy exclamations in words he did not know the meaning of, but the tone was unmistakably those of a sweetheart towards her lover. Finally, in answer to a true scientist's question in his eyes, she said in English, They caught the thing alive. They await your order to advance." "Let us be on our way," said Larner, and he started to arise. "You are hardly strong enough," said Tula. "Believe me, I'm all right," insisted Larner, and after several trials he got to his feet. His constitution was naturally strong, and his will was stronger, so he fought back all feelings of weakness and soon announced himself ready to go ahead with the project at hand. For speed was all important, and the young professor found himself unable to remain inactive. He rejoiced when Zorn told him that the big insect that had attacked Tula Bela had been captured alive and had been kept well nourished by Lat's blood injected into its stomach. With Zorn, Larner went to inspect the hideous monstrosity and found it in leash and straining. It was ready to be used to lead the way back to its breeding place. Its wings shackled, the lumbering insect floundered on its way straight north. Ponderously and half-blindly, it crawled as the searchlight's glare was kept far enough in advance to keep from blinding the monster. True to instinct, it finally brought up at early dawn under a high cliff of smoky quartz. Here, in the great crevices, the drove of diabolical vampires were hiding. As the light struck their dens, they attempted clumsily to take wing, but an interlacing network of devastating disintegrating rays from the ray guns shattered their bodies to dust, which was borne away by the wind. The next few months were spent in combing the quartz crags of Venus for similar infested areas, but only the one breeding nest was found. The scourge had been conquered in its first and only stronghold. So ended the greatest reign of terror in the history of Venus. Leslie Larner was given a vote of thanks, and riches were showered upon him by the good people of the sky's brightest star. His modesty was characteristic, and he insisted that his part in saving humanity on the planet had been small. Passage back to Earth was offered him, but Nirn and Tula Bela urged him to stay and live his life on Venus. This he finally agreed to do. "If I returned," he said, "I would always be tempted to tell my experiences while away, and there is not a jury in the world which would account me sane after I had once spoken." That the story of Larner's adventure reached Earth-dwellers at all is due to the fact that Nirn Bela, on a subsequent visit to the Earth, narrated it to a Colorado quartz miner. This miner, a bronzed and bearded prospector for gold, stumbled on the Targo in a mountain fastness, and there was naught to do but make him welcome and pledge him to secrecy. The miner surveyed the crystal Targo in rapt wonderment and said, "And to think I'm the only Earthman who ever viewed such a craft." "No," answered Nirn Bela, "there is one other." And then the stirring story of Leslie Larner's life on Venus was told. The End of Vampires of Venus.